She had one boot out the door and a stolen horse saddled in the dark when his voice stopped her cold, low, steady, carrying no anger and no demand. Just 4 words that cut through the freezing Montana night like a blade through thin ice. Don't run tonight. Grace Sullivan had outrun sheriff's creditors and one man who swore he'd find her no matter where she hid. But she had never once been stopped by kindness, and she didn't know what to do with it. If you've ever been too afraid to trust someone who deserved it, this story is for you. Subscribe, watch all the way through, and tell us in the comments. What city are you watching from tonight? The stage pulled into Black Hollow Valley just after 10 o'clock, 2 hours late, because the rear axle had cracked on the mountain pass, and the driver had spent 40 minutes cursing at it in the dark, while 3 passengers sat inside, pretending they weren't cold. Grace Sullivan was not pretending anything. She sat with her back straight, her worn leather traveling bag held across her lap like a shield, and her eyes fixed on the window, even though there was nothing to see. Just black mountain, just cold pine, just the occasional flicker of a lantern in some distant farmhouse window. Some family warm inside, settled unafraid. And Grace watched those lights the way a drowning person watches a boat that's already passed. She had $12.40, a change of clothes, a name that was only half real, and a plan that lasted exactly until morning. The town itself was smaller than she expected. Most mountain towns in Montana were in 1883 a main street of maybe 8 or 10 buildings, a general store, a feed barn, a saloon that was also apparently the post office, and a boarding house at the far end called Hattie's Place, which was painted a color that might once have been yellow and was now the particular shade of gray that comes from too many hard winters and not enough care. Grace paid the driver without speaking to him, stepped down onto the frozen mud of Black Hollow's Main Street, and stood there for exactly 4 seconds before she made her first decision of the night. She needed a room. Just one night. She would work out the rest by daylight. Hattie Drummond was a woman of approximately 60, who wore her silver hair pinned up like a crown and had the particular expression of someone who had seen everything twice and stopped being surprised by any of it. She looked at us the way a woman looks at a traveling bag, assessing weight, guessing contents, deciding whether the whole thing was worth the trouble. $2 a week paid up front. Breakfast at 7. You're late for supper, but I can leave biscuits. One night. Hattie's expression did not change. I don't do one nights. Too much work for a bed that's only warmed once. Grace set $2 on the counter. One night. Something shifted in Hattie's face. Not softness exactly. More like recognition. The way one careful woman looks at another and understands without being told that the $2 bill means something serious, that the straight back and the flat voice are not rudeness, but armor, and that pushing harder would be unkind. She took the money. Rooms at the top of the stairs, second door on the left. Don't use the first door, that's Mr. Bellamy, and he snores like a mule dying. Grace took the key. She did not say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because gratitude required stopping, and stopping required trusting that she'd still be standing in the same place long enough for the words to matter. The room was small and cold. There was an iron frame bed with 2 wool blankets, a washstand with a cracked pitcher, and a single window that looked out over the back of the building toward a dark line of pine trees, and beyond that, the mountain. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and did not move for a long time. She listened to the sounds of the town settling, a door closing somewhere, a horse shifting in a nearby stable, the low rumble of voices from the saloon, 2 buildings over. Normal sounds. Safe sounds maybe to someone who had earned the right to feel safe. She pulled the bag onto her lap and opened it, not to look for anything, but just to feel the familiar weight of her own things, the objects that proved she existed and belonged to herself. A hairbrush. A small tin of dried lavender she'd carried from Ohio 3 years ago. A folded letter she had never opened. A small bone-handled knife she wore at her hip most days and kept under her pillow every night. She took the knife out and set it on the pillow. Old habit. She would get the horse in the morning. She had already noted the livery stable at the edge of town, old building probably unlocked on the south side. She was not proud of the thought. She had not started her life as someone who thought about which livery stables were unlocked. But life had a way of reshaping a person, and Grace had been reshaped more than once, and she had learned that survival did not always look like the thing you planned to be. She had a name. She was moving toward a town called Ridgecrest, 3 days' ride east, where a woman named Bertie Fowler ran a boarding house and had once told Grace on a train platform in Billings that if Grace ever needed a fresh start, Bertie had a room and didn't ask questions. Grace was counting on that. She blew out the lamp, lay down on top of the blankets without undressing, closed her eyes. She did not sleep. In the morning, or what passed for morning, which was really the deep dead middle of the night at around 3 a.m., when the saloon had gone quiet and the mountain cold had pushed itself through every crack in the boarding house wall, Grace heard something. Not inside. Outside. A man's voice low talking to something that wasn't talking back. She was at the window before she was fully awake, the knife in her hand, her body ahead of her mind, the way it always was in strange places. She looked down into the dark behind the building. There was a man crouching in the frozen dirt near the tree line. How was big? She could see that, even in the dark, even from the second floor. Broad shoulders, a dark coat, a hat pulled low. He was crouching over something small, and she couldn't tell what it was, but she could hear his voice, and his voice was the most surprising thing about him. It was gentle, quiet, and deliberate, and entirely without aggression. The tone of a man who understood that the thing he was talking to was frightened, and that volume would only make it worse. She couldn't hear the words. Just the cadence, low and steady and patient, like water moving over rock. The small shape in the dirt moved. A dog maybe, something injured. It shifted toward the man's hand, and then away toward him, and away doing what frightened things do, wanting comfort and not trusting it. Grace watched him hold perfectly still. He didn't reach. He didn't grab. He just stayed crouched in the frozen dirt in the middle of the night and waited. And eventually the small shape moved close enough that his hand could rest on it barely, just barely, and he held it there. Grace lowered the knife. She didn't know why. She went back to bed. She was at the livery stable at 4:15. The south door was in fact unlocked. She had brought her bag, her $12, and her careful, practiced quiet, the absence of sound that she had gotten very good at over the years. She was 3 steps inside, eyes adjusting to the dark, when someone spoke. "Planning to buy one, or were you going to work out the paperwork later?" She spun around. Howe was standing just inside the main door. The big man from behind the boarding house. She was almost sure the same broad shoulders and the same dark coat. He was holding a lantern at his side, low, not shining it at her directly, which was either manners or strategy, and she hadn't decided which. "I wasn't stealing." The words came out before she'd decided to say them, which told her something about how rattled she already was. "I didn't say you were." "You implied it." I asked a question. Grace's hand moved toward her hip without conscious decision. The knife was there, handle familiar against her palm. She didn't draw it. She was not, despite everything, a person who drew knives on unarmed men in livery stables at 4 a.m. without a better reason than embarrassment. "I'm passing through," she said. "I needed a horse. The livery opens at 6. "I'm aware." A pause. He set the lantern on a post hook, and she could see him better now, mid-30s maybe, with a short dark beard and the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and showed it not unhandsome, but not soft either. His eyes were doing something careful and specific. They were reading her without performing the act of reading her. The way some men stared and made sure you felt it, and this man was doing the opposite. He was looking the way someone looks when they're trying not to make you feel watched. She didn't trust it. She trusted that she didn't trust it, though, which was at least consistent. "Luke Harrison," he said. "I run the place 3 mornings a week when Denny's hip is bad." "Grace." She stopped there. He didn't ask for the rest of it. That was the first strange thing. "You want a horse," he said. Not a question, just a restatement of a fact. "Where are you headed?" "Ridgecrest." "That's 3 days in good weather. Weather's not going to be good." He glanced toward the stable doors, toward the cold and dark outside. "Storm coming in off the northern range, probably by afternoon tomorrow, maybe sooner." "I'll be fine." "You might be." Or you might be stuck on the mountain pass in 4 feet of snow on a horse you don't know in weather that's killed people who knew what they were doing. He didn't say it like a threat. He said it like a man who had pulled someone off a mountain pass in 4 feet of snow and didn't want to do it again. Ridgecrest'll still be there in 4 days. I can't wait 4 days. What happens in 4 days? She looked at him. He looked back. You don't have to tell me, he said. I'm just asking so I understand whether we're talking about a choice or a necessity. Grace had been questioned by sheriffs, by creditors, by a man who had hired detectives to track where she'd gone, and had sat across from her in a Billings hotel lobby and asked questions with the patience of someone who already knew all the answers. She had learned to read questions the way some people read weather, what they were really asking, what they already suspected, what information they were actually trying to extract. Luke Harrison's question was what it appeared to be. That was the second strange thing. It's a choice, she said, because it was technically, even if it didn't feel like one. Then you've got a little room. He took the lantern down from the hook and turned toward the stable interior. Come on, I'll show you what I've got. If you're going to ride out, at least take an animal that knows the mountain. She followed him. She told herself it was just because it was practical. His name meant something in Black Hollow Valley. She understood that within 10 minutes of watching him move through the stable, the way the horses responded to him, the quiet authority of a man who had earned a specific kind of respect from specific kinds of creatures. He knew each animal individually. This one had a sore left foreleg, that one was too green for mountain riding. The gray mare in the corner was steady and smart, and had made the pass to Ridgecrest twice. He said all of it without performing expertise. He just said it the way you tell someone something that's true. The gray mare, Grace said. Good choice. He bridled her without asking Grace to step back, without the performative display of competence that some men used on women who were watching. Look how capable I am. Look how you should need me. He just did the thing efficiently and handed Grace the lead. $7, he said. Denny'll square it in the morning. She almost said she didn't have $7 to spare. She almost said a lot of things. She paid him and took the lead and stood in the dark stable holding a horse she hadn't planned to pay for, and felt for a moment the specific disorientation of a plan going differently than planned in a direction that wasn't obviously worse. There's feed on the south wall, Luke said. You can wait out the dark here if you want. Warmer than the street. I'm leaving now. He nodded once. He did not argue. He did not try to talk her into staying, or explain all the reasons she was making a mistake, or give her the long, patient reasoned speech that men gave women when they wanted to feel like they were helping and were actually just talking. He walked her out to the door and held it while she led the mare through, and the freezing Montana night hit them both like a fist, and Grace had one foot in the stirrup when he said it. Quietly. Just that quietly. No urgency, no anger, no demand. Don't run tonight. She stopped. She didn't know why she stopped. She had her foot in the stirrup, her bag across her shoulder. $7 spent on a gray mare named, she didn't even know her name yet, and the road to Ridgecrest was 3 days away, and there was a storm coming, and none of that had been enough to stop her. None of it. But 4 words from a man she had known for 40 minutes stopped her like a wall. She stood with her foot in the stirrup and didn't move. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, not performing it, not leaning into it, not asking her to believe him as if belief were something she owed him, just stating it. I don't know what you're running from. I don't need to know. But whatever it is, it'll follow you to Ridgecrest the same as it followed you here. Running in a storm on a strange mountain doesn't make the thing you're running from any smaller. Grace's boot came down from the stirrup. She hadn't decided to do it. Her body had done it before she caught up. She stood in the dirt holding the mare's lead and faced the dark, and didn't say anything for a long time, long enough that the silence between them became a specific kind of silence. Not uncomfortable. Not a silence waiting to be filled, but a silence with some kind of weight and shape that she couldn't have named if she'd tried. One more night, she said finally. That's all I'm suggesting. She looked at him. Why do you care? The question came out sharper than she'd meant it. Not accusation exactly, but close enough. She had learned that men who appeared to care usually wanted something in exchange for the caring, and she had paid that toll before and had the scar tissue to prove it. Luke thought about the question. She could see him thinking about it, not performing thought, not reaching for the right answer. Actually thinking the way people do when a question is worth a real answer. "Because you're a person standing in a freezing street about to ride into a storm," he said. "And that seems like a reason." She stared at him. He held her gaze without flinching and without pressing, without adding more words to fill the space the ones he'd already said had made. She took the mare back into the stable. One more night, just one more. Hattie Drummond was awake when Grace came back through the front door at 4:45 in the morning. This did not appear to surprise her. She was sitting in the front room with a cup of something hot wrapped in a quilt, the color of a winter field, and she looked at Grace with the calm expression of a woman who had waited up and was not going to say so. "Biscuits are still warm," she said. Grace sat down. She didn't know why she sat down. She had not planned to sit down. She had planned to go upstairs, wait out the remaining dark, reevaluate the storm situation at first light and leave by mid-morning at the latest. But she sat down, and Hattie poured her something hot from the pot on the stove. Not coffee, some kind of tea. Tea, strong and slightly bitter, and set a plate of biscuits within reach, and Grace wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the warmth move through her palms and up her arms, and she thought suddenly, and without warning, that she could not remember the last time she had sat still long enough to feel warm. "Luke Harrison," she said. "Who is he?" Hattie's expression told her she wasn't the first person to ask that question. "Born here, raised here. Lost his father when he was 16, ran the family ranch on his own, until the bank called the note when he was 22. Hattie refilled her own cup. Fought it, lost it. Spent 3 years working other men's cattle before he built his own place back up from the ground. Not what it was, but it's his. People say he's dangerous. People say a lot of things." Hattie ate a biscuit with the efficiency of someone who had been eating biscuits for 60 years and did not require conversation to do it. Luke Harrison is a man who doesn't explain himself and doesn't apologize and doesn't pretend to be smaller than he is. Some people call that dangerous because they don't know what else to call it. Grace thought about the stable, the lantern, the deliberate patience of a man crouching in the cold, talking an injured animal into trusting him. "What do you call it?" she asked. Hattie looked at her for a moment. "Lonely," she said. Morning came the way. Mountain mornings do, in November. Gray and reluctant and cold light, arriving without enthusiasm, the world making no promises. Grace was sitting in the front room still when Hattie's other boarders came down for breakfast. A Mr. Bellamy who snored and was apologetic about it. A young school teacher named Clara who was from Missouri and made the specific face that people from Missouri make when they've spent their first Montana winter. A man named Cord who worked the mine and didn't speak at breakfast, which Grace respected enormously. She was watching the street through the window when she saw Luke Harrison walk past. I didn't look towards the boarding house. He was carrying something, a paper-wrapped package from the general store, she thought. And he walked with the unhurried stride of a man who was going somewhere specific and was not in any hurry about it. He stopped at the far end of the street, where an elderly man was struggling with a cart that had gotten one wheel stuck in a frozen rut, and without being asked, without breaking stride in any meaningful way, as if it were simply part of the route. He set down his package, took hold of the cart's stuck wheel, and muscled it free in one firm pull. The old man said something. Luke shook his head, picked up his package, and kept walking. Clara, the school teacher eating eggs across the table, followed Grace's gaze out the window and made a small knowing sound. "That's Luke Harrison," she said. "He's done that sort of thing for half the town, and never once mentioned it. My first week here, my school stove broke in the middle of November. I came in one morning and it was fixed, and there was a cord of new wood stacked outside the door. I asked around for 3 days before someone finally told me it was him." She shook her head. "He won't even take a thank you. Just looks at you like you've said something in a foreign language." Grace set down her fork. How long has he been alone up there, Clara thought. Since I've been here 3 years. And they say before that too, after something happened. Nobody talks about it directly. She lowered her voice slightly. There's talk that a woman was involved, someone from before, but nobody seems to know the whole story, and he's not the kind of man you ask. Grace understood that kind of history, the kind that sits in the body long after the mind has tried to reason it away. She went to the stable in the afternoon. Not to leave. She had settled that at least for today, the storm that Luke had predicted had arrived exactly as forecast, a flat gray wall of cloud moving down from the north and bringing with it a wind that made the sign above the general store bang against its mounting like an alarm. Riding in this would be stupid, and Grace was many things, but she was not stupid. She went because the gray mare was there, and she wanted to know the animal she'd spent $7 on. Luke was there. Of course Luke was there. He was at the workbench at the back of the stable doing something with a piece of leather harness and an awl. His coat hung on a post, working in the focused, unhurried way that characterized everything she had seen him do. He looked up when she came in. He did not look surprised. "Storm's bad," she said. "It is." She went to the gray mare's stall. The mare turned to look at her with the calm, appraising intelligence of an animal that had decided she was probably not worth worrying about. Grace let her smell her hand. "What's her name?" Denny called her Smoke. A beat. "She doesn't seem attached to it." "Smoke's fine." Grace stroked the mare's nose. "She know the mountain. Better than most people do." He set down the awl and turned on the bench stool to face her more fully, not aggressively, just redirecting his attention. "You know how to read mountain weather." "Some. Some might not be enough on the North Pass in November." She looked at him. "Are you offering to teach me or just telling me I'm underprepared?" Something moved in his expression. It was very close to a smile, but not quite, more like the external evidence of something that had thought about being a smile and then decided against it. "Both, probably." She pulled up a stool from the corner of the stable and sat down. This was not what she had planned to do. "Tell me about the North Pass," she said. He did. He told her in the specific, useful way of someone who knows a piece of land by lived experience rather than description, where the wind came from at what time of day, which section of the trail held ice longest after a storm, where there was shelter, if a horse pulled up lame, how to read the sky at this elevation for what was coming in the next 6 hours. He talked without condescension, which was not nothing. She had encountered plenty of men who talked about things they knew to women, as if the women's not knowing were a character flaw, and this man talked to her the way he'd talk to anyone who needed the information and didn't have it yet. She asked questions. He answered them. They talked for 2 hours. The storm howled outside the stable walls. "Why did you come here?" he asked eventually. Not intrusively, the question rose naturally out of the conversation. The way questions do, when two people have been talking long enough that the background of their lives starts to matter. "I was passing through," she said. The standard answer. The polished one. He waited. She found herself looking at the storm, not at him, when she said, "I needed a place to stop for a while. Somewhere where nobody expected anything from me. And Black Hollow. A name on a stage route." She paused. "I didn't plan to stay even one night." "But you did. You said don't run." "I did." He turned the harness piece over in his hands. "I half expected to come out this morning and find the stable empty. I thought about it." "I know." She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because you're the kind of person who thinks about leaving every place you go." He said it without accusation, without pity, just as an observation, the way you observe weather. The way you held your bag when you came into Hattie's. The way you sat at breakfast this morning back to the wall facing the door. The way you looked at the road every time someone opened the front window. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly. The feeling that comes when something true is said out loud, that you've spent considerable energy keeping unspoken. "That's a lot to notice," she said. "I'm good at noticing things that are trying not to be noticed." He set the harness down. "I'm not saying it to make you uncomfortable. I'm saying it because I want you to know that you don't have to perform normal here. I've seen the real version already. It's fine." She stared at him. She didn't know what to do with that. She had been performing normal for 3 years. She was very good at it. She had a whole catalog of normal, the right kind of smile, the right kind of distance, the right kind of pleasant vacancy that made men stop looking too closely. And this man was sitting on a workbench in a Montana stable, telling her calmly and without drama that he had seen through it in 40 minutes and it was fine. Her first instinct was to deny it. Her second instinct was to leave. Her third instinct, the one that surprised her, the one that came from somewhere below, all the practiced responses, was to be furious that it was such a relief to be seen. She wasn't going to say that. She said, "You're very sure of yourself." "Not usually. I'm sure about this." He picked up the harness again. "You've been running for a long time and you're tired. That's not a judgment. That's just something I can see." Grace looked at her hands, at the long, cold fingers wrapped around nothing, and felt the exhaustion he was describing. Like a physical weight, felt it actually in her back and her shoulders and the place behind her eyes where the constant vigilance lived. The watching and the listening and the assessing and the planning for when the plan failed. She was tired. She was very, very tired. "I'll stay through the storm," she said. That was all she was promising. One storm. He nodded and went back to the harness, and Grace sat in the cold stable with the wind screaming outside and felt something small and tentative that she did not name, because naming it would make it possible to lose it, and she had lost enough already. 2 days later, she was still in Black Hollow. The storm had broken, but the roads had not the pass to Ridgecrest, thick with new snow, and the valley settled into the specific post-storm quiet of a place waiting to see what came next. Hattie had stopped asking about the room arrangement. Clara had started saving her a seat at breakfast. Even Cord the mine worker had apparently accepted her existence because he nodded at her once over his eggs, and Grace decided this was equivalent to a formal welcome in whatever language Cord was operating in. Luke came to the boarding house on the third morning. She had not expected that. He knocked. Hattie let him in. He stood in the front room with his hat in his hands and asked very directly and without preamble if Grace would want to ride out to the East Ridge with him. The pass was still closed, but the eastern trail was open, and he had to check the fence line before the next weather, and he thought she might want to see the valley from above before she made any decisions about leaving. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Hattie, who was watching with the elaborate neutrality of a woman who had very specific opinions and was choosing not to share them. "I'll get my coat," Grace said. She told herself it was because she needed to know the land. She told herself it was practical. She was a good liar, but she was getting tired of lying to herself. The East Ridge in November was a kind of beautiful that almost hurt everything. Silver and white and sharp-edged. The kind of world that looked like it had been made that morning and was still deciding whether to be permanent. Grace rode beside Luke on Smoke and didn't talk much, and he didn't talk much, and the silence between them on the mountain was different from the silences she was used to, which were silences full of things unsaid and threats unspoken. This silence was just present, like the cold, like the light, not uncomfortable. She didn't know what to do with that either. They stopped at the ridge, and she looked out over Black Hollow Valley, the small collection of buildings that made up the town, the dark thread of the river, the scattered ranches like islands in the white, and she thought about how it looked from up here, small, manageable, harmless. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every time I come up here." He was looking at the same view. "Every time I come up here, and I think about it, and then I look at it, and I don't." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment, a long one. "Because it's mine," he said. "Not the land the bank'll tell you different about the land, but the knowing of it. The way I know where the elk come down in February, and where the creek runs fastest in spring, and which families in that valley will need help before they ask. You can't take that with you. You leave it, it stays here." Grace looked at the valley. She thought about what she knew. What places she had a knowing of. Whether there was anywhere on this earth where she could say, "This is mine, this knowing is mine." She could not think of one. That absence hit her somewhere unexpected, not in the chest, which was where she kept the grief she was prepared for, but somewhere lower, somewhere more physical, a punch below the ribs. She had not known until that moment how much she had lost. She had thought she was just moving. She had thought she was just surviving. She had not counted, had not tallied, had not let herself understand how many places she had passed through without touching, without being touched, without accumulating the specific kind of wealth that comes from staying. "I don't have anything like that," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "You haven't stayed anywhere long enough," Luke said. Not an accusation, not a prescription, just a fact delivered with the same quiet directness he seemed to bring to all facts. She looked at him. He was looking at her now, not the valley. "I know what you're about to say," she told him. "Do you? You're going to tell me I should stay." He shook his head. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. "That's not mine to tell. I'm just saying." He paused. "I'm saying that you rode out here, and you looked at this valley, and something happened in your face that I don't think you knew was going to happen. And whatever that was, it's worth not running past it." Grace turned back to the view. Her chest felt too full, and she was furious about it. She was furious that a man she had known for 3 days could see something happening in her face that she hadn't known was happening. She was furious that he wasn't wrong. She was furious most of all at the size of the wanting she had been outrunning the wanting for something solid and known and permanent. The wanting she had sewn shut so carefully, and that was apparently not as carefully sewn as she had believed. "What happened to the woman?" she asked. He went still. Not stiff still. The difference between tension and quiet. "Clara said there was someone," Grace said. "Before. She didn't know the whole story." A long pause. The wind moved through the pines below them, and the cold settled around them, and she thought maybe he was going to say nothing that she had pushed somewhere she shouldn't have, and the nothing would be her answer. "Her name was Elaine," he said. "We were going to be married. She chose someone else, someone with more money and a bigger ranch and fewer hard years ahead of him." He turned the reins over in his gloved hand. "I didn't blame her, not eventually, but I was angry for a long time." "Is that why you stayed?" He looked at her. "I stayed because this valley is mine," he said. "She's got nothing to do with it." A pause. "But she's why I learned to recognize what running looks like, on a person. The particular way someone holds themselves when they've spent a lot of time getting ready to leave." Grace thought about that. "You think you understand what I'm doing. I think I understand the shape of it. You don't know what happened to me." "No," he agreed. "I don't." Silence. "You could tell me," he said. "Or not. Either one." Grace looked at the valley one more time. She thought about the folded letter in her bag that she had never opened. She thought about the man who had written it. She thought about everything she had survived, and everything she had lost, and everything she had cut loose and left behind in order to keep moving. And she thought about whether any of it had actually stayed behind the way she'd intended, or whether it had just been following her this whole time, patient as a debt. She did not tell him. Not today. But she looked at Luke Harrison on that ridge in the November cold, and she thought against everything she had taught herself to think against the careful architecture of 3 years of survival. Maybe. Just maybe. And she did not run, and that maybe sat in her chest. The whole ride back down the mountain, small and fragile as a candle flame in an open doorway. Something she cupped her hands around without quite admitting she was doing it. 3 more days passed before Grace Sullivan admitted to herself that she was no longer passing through Black Hollow Valley. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't say it to Hattie, who had long since stopped counting the days on Grace's original $2 arrangement, and had simply begun adding it to a running tab, with the quiet dignity of a woman who understood that some things didn't need to be named to be real. She didn't say it to Clara, who had started leaving a second cup out at the breakfast table without being asked. She didn't say it to Luke Harrison, who came through town most mornings, and always seemed to have a reason to stop near wherever Grace happened to be standing, without ever making the stopping look like a reason. She said it to Smoke the gray mare one morning in the stable, when it was just the two of them, and the cold, and the particular honesty that comes from talking to horses who judge nothing and remember everything. "I'm still here," Grace said, brushing out the mare's mane. Smoke flicked one ear back, interested. "I don't know why I'm still here. The mare turned her head and looked at Grace with one large, dark, entirely calm eye, and Grace looked back at her and felt the absurdity of the situation as a physical sensation. A woman who had survived a great deal of terrible things, brought to a standstill by a valley she hadn't planned to look at, and a man she hadn't planned to talk to, and the alarming discovery that she was not apparently as finished with wanting things as she had believed. She finished brushing smoke and went to find Hattie to ask about work. Hattie had work. There was always work in a boarding house: laundry, mending, cooking for the week's residents, managing the endless small repairs that an old building in a hard climate required constantly. Hattie ran through without softening it, the way she ran through everything, direct and without apology. And Grace listened and said she'd do all of it. All of it, Hattie repeated. I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for occupied. Hattie gave her a long look, the kind that takes a person's measure without asking permission. $50 a week, room and board included. I'm not running a charity and I won't pretend otherwise. I'm not asking for charity. No, Hattie said. You're not. And that was that. Grace started that afternoon, and the work was exactly what she needed. Physical, demanding, concrete, the kind of labor that fills the hands and quiets the mind. She learned the rhythms of the boarding house, which boarders wanted talking to, and which wanted leaving alone. How Hattie liked the sheets folded, which step on the back staircase creaked loudest, and how to skip it at 5 in the morning when the rest of the house was still sleeping. She learned the rhythms of the town too, in the way you learn a place when you stop trying to stay outside of it. The shop owners' names, the patterns of who came in on what day, the specific social geography of a small mountain community that had been living with itself long enough to have a complicated history it only half remembered accurately. She heard things about Luke Harrison. She had expected to hear things about Luke Harrison. What she had not expected was how little the things she heard matched the man she had been spending time with. It was Cord, the mine worker, who said it first. He said it to another man at the breakfast table one morning, not directed at Grace, not performing for her, just two men talking across eggs and biscuits, the way men do when they've forgotten a woman is in the room. Harrison turned down $2,000 from the Beaumont people, Cord said. The other man, a traveling merchant named Haskell, who stopped in Black Hollow every other week, let out a low whistle. For the East pasture land. For all of it. The whole East Range claim. They came up twice. Second time they sent a lawyer. Cord ate a bite of egg. Luke showed the lawyer the gate and told him the gate was the last polite thing he was going to show him. Haskell shook his head. Beaumont doesn't take no well. No, he does not. Grace kept her eyes on her plate and did not appear to be listening with the focused attention she was absolutely applying. What does Beaumont want with the East Range? She asked, casual, reaching for the butter. Cord looked at her. He was not a man who spoke to people he hadn't decided were worth speaking to, and Grace had apparently somewhere in the past week been decided upon. Water rights, Cord said. There's a spring-fed creek that runs through Luke's east pasture and comes out into the valley. Control the creek, you control a lot of the smaller farms downstream. Beaumont's been buying up land in this valley for 2 years. Luke's the only one who hasn't sold. Why hasn't he sold? Cord looked at her like she'd asked why the sun was warm. Because it's his. She thought about the ridge. The way Luke had said it, not the land the bank'll tell you different about the land, but the knowing. The specific wealth of staying. She thought about a man who had built something back from ruin once, and was not going to watch it taken from him again without a fight. She thought about what it cost to hold a thing that powerful people wanted. She went to find Luke that afternoon. How was where he often was in the afternoons, when he was in town at the east end of the main street, helping a neighbor repair a fence section that the storm had knocked in. The neighbor, an older rancher named Gus, was clearly doing the directing, and Luke was doing the actual physical work of it, which seemed to be the arrangement they'd come to without discussing it. Grace waited until Gus went back inside before she spoke. Tell me about Beaumont. Luke set down the fence post. He looked at her with the direct, assessing calm that was his standard mode of looking at things that surprised him. Who told you about Beaumont? People talk at breakfast. He picked up his gloves from the post rail and pulled them on. What do you want to know? Cord says he's been buying up the valley. Says you're the only one who hasn't sold. That's right. He says Beaumont doesn't take no well. That's also right. Grace crossed her arms against the cold and looked at him steadily. How bad is it? Luke was quiet for a moment. The specific quality of this quiet was different from his usual. There was something in it that was weighing, deciding how much to say. He sent men to the property line 3 weeks ago, Luke said. 6 of them. Said they were surveyors. Were they? They were carrying rifles and wearing Beaumont's brand. They weren't surveyors. Grace felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air. What did you do? Told them to get off my land. They didn't move. I moved them. Alone. I own the land alone. Seems appropriate. She stared at him. Luke, 6 men. I've handled worse. He said it without bravado, which was somehow more alarming than if he'd said it with bravado. The point is, Beaumont sent lawyers first, then surveyors, then armed men pretending to be surveyors. The escalation has a direction. And what's at the end of that direction? He looked at her. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Grace had come from a world where powerful men with a direction could end in only a few specific places, and none of them were good. You need help, she said. I need the law. The sheriff in this county works for a living wage, and Beaumont pays better than a living wage. A muscle moved in his jaw. I've written to the land office twice. I'm waiting on replies. What if the replies don't come in time? Then I figure out something else. She looked at this man, this particular frustrating, quietly extraordinary man, and felt something shift in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. Not the small tentative maybe from the ridge. Something harder and more decided than that. Something that felt less like wanting and more like choosing. She had spent 3 years not choosing anything except the direction of the road. I can write, she said. He blinked. What? I can write. Letters. Legal letters, formal ones. The kind that sound like they come from someone who knows what a legal letter is supposed to sound like. She kept her voice even. I worked for a law office in Cincinnati for 2 years. Before. She stopped. I know how to draft a complaint. I know what the land office needs to hear. Luke Harrison looked at her for a long, careful moment. She watched him resist the urge to tell her she didn't have to. She watched him understand that she already knew she didn't have to. All right, he said. They worked at Hattie's front table 3 evenings in a row. Grace with paper and pen, and the particular focused energy of someone doing the thing they're actually good at. Luke sitting across from her with the deed documents and the survey records he'd kept locked in a tin box under his floorboards. The kind of care that spoke to a man who had been burned by a bank once and had decided that documentation was the only real wall between himself and the next catastrophe. The letters took shape, careful, precise, citing the relevant statutes and the specific violations and the specific witnesses and the specific dates. The language that land office clerks understood, because it was the language they'd written themselves. Grace wrote them the way she had been trained to write them, without anger, without heat, with the cold, implacable logic of someone who knew the rules and intended to use them as weapons. Luke read each draft and said almost nothing, which she took as approval until he pushed one back across the table with a single word circled. This one, he said, tapping the circled word. It'll read like accusation. She looked at it. He was right. Implication works better. Usually does. She rewrote it. He read it again. Nodded. Clara stopped by on the second evening to drop off a book she'd promised Hattie and saw the two of them bent over papers in the lamplight, and her expression went through several stages before it settled on something serene and knowing that Grace chose not to address. On the third evening, Hattie brought tea without being asked and set it between them and walked away, and Grace thought about the quiet conspiracy of women who had decided something was happening and had decided to help it along without announcing that they were doing it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She was sure she was grateful for the tea. The letters went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, something else had arrived in their place. Grace was in the mercantile picking up thread for Hattie's mending account when a man she didn't recognize came through the door and stood at the counter with the particular stillness of someone who had been sent to a specific place for a specific purpose. He was well dressed by Black Hollow standards. Good coat, clean boots. The careful grooming of a man who worked for someone who expected a certain presentation. He looked at Grace. She had been in enough rooms, with enough dangerous men, to understand when she was being looked at by someone who already knew exactly who she was. "Miss Sullivan." He said it pleasantly with a professional smile that was 3 inches away from his eyes. "My employer would like a word." Her hands were perfectly still on the thread she'd been examining. "Your employer, Mr. Beaumont. He's in town for the week and heard there was a newcomer helping Mr. Harrison with some legal correspondence." The smile did not waver. "He'd simply like to introduce himself." Grace set the thread on the counter. "Tell Mr. Beaumont," she said, "that I don't have meetings with strangers." The man's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Mr. Beaumont isn't really a stranger. He owns quite a bit of this valley." "Not all of it. A beat." The smile changed, not much, but enough. "Not yet." Grace picked up the thread, paid for it, and walked out of the mercantile without hurrying, because hurrying would look like fear, and she was not going to look afraid of a well-dressed messenger in a dry goods store in front of witnesses. She walked 2 blocks before her hands started shaking. She stopped in the alley beside the feed barn and pressed her back against the wall and breathed deliberately through her nose, the way she had learned to breathe in the bad years, the years when shaking was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had learned to funnel the fear into something smaller and use it for fuel. She stood there for 60 seconds. Then she went to find Luke. She found him at the smithy on the north end of town, where he had apparently come to pick up a repaired piece of equipment and had gotten into a conversation with the smith, a barrel-shaped man named Otto, who held strong opinions about horse breeding and was not shy about sharing them. Luke extricated himself with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to conversations that needed extricating from. He took one look at Grace's face. "What happened?" she told him. All of it exactly as it had happened, in the specific detail that was useful: the man's appearance, his exact words, the shift in his expression at the mention of the East Range. She kept her voice level. She was good at level. Luke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. His jaw was doing the thing, the subtle tightening that she had come to understand was him deciding how angry he was and how much of it to let show. "He's in town," Luke said. "That's what the man said. Beaumont doesn't come to Black Hollow. He sends people." He looked past her toward the main street. "He came himself because he wanted you to know he came himself. He wanted me to know he knows I exist." Grace kept her voice flat. "He wanted me to understand that helping you has a cost. I should have thought of that." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry. I didn't think about what it would mean for you, him finding out you were involved." Something lurched in her, hot and almost angry. "Don't apologize. I made the choice with my own eyes open. You made it without knowing there was a man like Beaumont on the other side of it. It wouldn't have changed anything." He looked at her. She looked back and meant it, and she could see the moment he understood that she meant it, and something happened in his face that was different from anything she had seen there before. Not relief, exactly, not gratitude, something quieter and more serious than both. "All right," he said again. The same 2 words from the stable from the evening of the letters, but they carried more weight now. "What do we do?" she asked. "We don't do anything differently. The letters are sent. The evidence is documented." He put his hat on. "But I think you should know if Beaumont is in town in person, something is about to happen. He doesn't come himself for routine pressure." "What kind of something?" "I don't know yet." He started walking. "Come on." She fell into step beside him, not behind him, and he did not adjust his stride to put her there. They walked side by side down the main street in the thin November light, and Grace was acutely aware of what that looked like. A man and a woman walking together in a small town walked together. They were connected in the town's mind, whatever the actual arrangement, and she was aware of the awareness and found to her own surprise that she did not care about it. That was new. Beaumont himself appeared that afternoon. She saw him from the window of the boarding house, a heavy, prosperous-looking man in his 50s with silver hair and a coat that said money in a very specific, deliberate way. He was standing on the main street talking to the sheriff, and the conversation had the easy established comfort of two men who had talked many times before in the way that meant something about who owed what to whom. Grace watched the sheriff nod 3 times. She watched Beaumont clap the sheriff on the shoulder with the particular intimacy of a man who pays for that familiarity. She watched the sheriff go back into his office. Then Beaumont turned unhurried and looked directly at the boarding house window, directly at Grace. He smiled. She didn't move. She let him see her standing there, still looking back, and she kept her face entirely neutral, and then she turned and walked away from the window at her own pace, because she was not going to be the one who looked away first, and she was not going to look rattled by a fat man with a coat. But her heart was going at a pace that had nothing to do with calm. She had seen that smile before, on a different face. A man in Cincinnati who also smiled like that, the smile of someone who believed that the world was divided into people who had power, and people who were about to understand what happened when they stood in power's way. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She had left Cincinnati because of a man who smiled like that. She had run from Ohio to Indiana, to Illinois, to Missouri, to Kansas, to Colorado, to Montana, and she had thought she was outrunning a specific person and a specific situation and sitting on the edge of a boarding house bed in Black Hollow Valley. She understood suddenly with a clarity that was almost physical that she had not been outrunning a person at all. She had been outrunning a pattern, and the pattern had been here all along, waiting for her. She did not tell Luke this. Not that evening, not when he came by to tell her that Beaumont had taken a room at the saloon for the week, not when she could hear the shape of the problem sharpening around them. She was not ready to tell him the full architecture of where she came from. She had given him pieces: the law office in Cincinnati, the years of careful moving, but not the structure that held the pieces together. Part of that was habit. Part of it was something else she was still working out. She told him instead what she had seen from the window, the meeting with the sheriff, the handshake, the look. Luke took it in without visible surprise, which told her he had already known about the sheriff and Beaumont's relationship and had been factoring it into his calculations. "I have one honest man in this county," Luke said. They were in the boarding house front room, Hattie conspicuously absent in the kitchen, doing something that involved very little noise. Deputy Sam Coulter. He's 23 and not afraid of anything yet, which is the only good reason to trust him. "You think it'll come to the sheriff?" "Beaumont came himself. He wants this settled." His eyes were steady, but she could see the edges of the problem in the way he held himself, that contained deliberate stillness, that was not calm, but the management of something beneath calm. "He's going to make an offer, a final one, in person this time. And when you say no, then we find out what he does after the final offer." She looked at him. "You could sell." The silence that followed was not empty. "You could," she said again, quietly, not pushing. "You could take the money and go somewhere else and build something new. You've done it before." "I've done it before," he said, "because the bank took it. If I sell to Beaumont, I'm giving him the water rights that 10 families downstream depend on. He'll price them off their land inside of 2 years. His voice was even. "It's not only about mine." Grace had known this. She had known it the moment Cord explained the creek. She had asked the question anyway, because she needed to hear him say it, needed to verify that the man she was coming to understand was the man he actually was, not a version she had constructed from hope and proximity. He was. She felt that settle in her chest, like something heavy finding its place. "Then we stand," she said. "We," he repeated, not questioning it exactly, just holding it. "We," she said. "Chang." Beaumont's man came to the boarding house the next morning. Not the same one from the mercantile, a different one, older, carrying a sealed envelope. He handed it to Hattie at the door, with the professional politeness of someone who had delivered a great many such envelopes and was not responsible for their contents. Hattie brought it to Grace at breakfast without comment. Grace opened it. It was an offer. Specific, formal, generous by anyone's measure, twice the market value of the land and the water rights, both with a clause about relocating expenses that was almost kind in its condescension. It was the kind of offer that was meant to look like the very last reasonable thing, the thing you refused only at the cost of appearing unreasonable. At the bottom, in different handwriting than the formal text, 2 sentences. I understand you've been helping Mr. Harrison with his legal correspondence. I'd like to make you the same offer a fresh start elsewhere with sufficient funds to make it comfortable. Grace folded the letter once precisely and set it down next to her tea. Clara was watching her from across the table with the particular expression of a schoolteacher who has been trying not to read the letter and has entirely read the letter. He made you an offer, Clara said. He made me a warning. Clara was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Grace picked up her cup. Write him back, she said. The reply took her 40 minutes. It was the most economical thing she had written since Cincinnati, 1 paragraph, clear and specific, citing the relevant legal statutes, protecting tenants who engage in lawful assistance of property disputes, informing Mr. Beaumont that his communication had been noted and would be included in the existing documentation sent to the land office, and wishing him a comfortable stay in Black Hollow Valley. It was polite. It was devastating. She sealed it, wrote Beaumont's name on the front, and gave it to Hattie's young neighbor boy to deliver to the saloon, because she was not going to deliver it herself and give Beaumont the satisfaction of a direct encounter on his terms. Then she sat at the table and waited for the shaking to start. It didn't. She sat there and felt instead something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the particular grounded feeling of having fought back in a way that was entirely her own, without someone telling her to, without someone covering for her, without running. She had planted her feet. She had not known she still knew how to do that. Luke found out about the letter to Beaumont by the simple method of the town being small and Beaumont being loudly displeased, which was apparently audible from the saloon through 2 walls. He came to the boarding house at midday. He stood in the front room and looked at Grace with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that mixed admiration and alarm in roughly equal measure. You sent him a legal notice. I sent him a letter. He's calling it a legal notice. He's been talking about it in the saloon all morning. I took his hat off and held it. Grace, he has men in this town. I know. I mean, he has men here specifically because things like this happen and then things escalate after they happen. I know that too. Then why? Because he came after me first. She said it without heat, without drama, with the flat certainty of a statement of fact. He sent his man to the mercantile. He put his name on an envelope. He made it about me. She looked at Luke. I don't let people make it about me and then pretend they didn't. Luke Harrison stood in Hattie Drummond's front room, holding his hat, and looked at Grace Sullivan, and whatever he saw, it moved something in him that she could see the edges of something behind his eyes, something that had been held very carefully for a very long time, and had just been given without ceremony a reason to shift. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more. He paused. I don't know. Someone who needed more reassurance. Grace looked at him. I've been taking care of myself for 3 years. I don't need reassurance. I need accurate information and enough room to move. You've got both. Then we're fine. He nodded slowly. Then, with the careful deliberation of a man doing something he has thought about more than he intends to show, he reached over and put his hand over hers on the back of the chair, not squeezing, not claiming just present. Warm through the worn leather of his glove. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he took it away. Grace did not move for a long moment after he left. She sat with the warmth of that small, deliberate, entirely serious gesture and felt it the way you feel. A first fire in a cold room. The specific, almost painful pleasure of heat reaching. Something that has been cold for so long, it had forgotten what warm felt like. She was not going to make more of it than it was. She was not going to make less of it either. She went upstairs and took the folded letter from her bag, the one she had never opened, the one from Cincinnati, the one she had carried across 6 states and 11 towns like a penance. She hadn't paid yet, and she held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time. She put it back without opening it. Not yet. But she put it back, and for the first time in 3 years, she did it with the feeling that the not yet had an endpoint. That she was not running from the letter anymore. She was just waiting until she had enough solid ground under her feet to be able to read what it said and survive it. She thought she might be getting there, that solid ground she'd been moving toward for 3 years. One careful step at a time, except that solid ground had a way of shifting without warning, and what happened on the fourth day after Beaumont's letter arrived was proof that she had not yet learned to stop being surprised by that. The letter came on a Wednesday, not from the land office, not from Beaumont. From a man named Daniel Marsh, written in handwriting she recognized the way you recognize an old scar, not with surprise but with the particular cold of something you had hoped was behind you and had always suspected wasn't. Hattie brought it up without ceremony, set it on the washstand while Grace was making the bed, said only, "Came on the morning stage," and left because Hattie was a woman who understood that some envelopes announced themselves and that the right response to them was to leave the recipient alone with whatever they contained. Grace stood looking at the envelope for a full minute before she picked it up. The return address was Cincinnati. She opened it. It was short. Daniel Marsh had always been economical with words when he was certain of his power. Long letters were for people who needed to convince. He wrote 4 sentences. He had heard she was in Montana. He had business interests that had recently expanded in that direction. He would be traveling west within the month. He looked forward to resolving outstanding matters in person. Outstanding matters. 2 words that contained between them 3 years of running. Grace folded the letter, set it on the washstand, sat down on the edge of the bed with her hands flat on her knees, and felt the specific physical sensation of a wall she had been building suddenly revealed as paper. All that distance, all those roads, all those towns she had passed through without stopping. And here it was, 4 sentences on a page, telling her that distance was not the same thing as safe. She had known this. She had always known this. She had just gotten distracted. By a valley and a gray mare, and a man who didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. And 3 weeks of something that had felt dangerously and foolishly like the beginning of staying. She sat on this bed for a long time. Then she got up, went to the window, and looked at the street below with the particular look of a woman calculating distances. She did not go to Luke. She told herself this was because the situation with Beaumont was already complicated enough, and adding her history to it would only create more problems. She told herself Luke had enough to manage. She told herself this was her problem, and she handled her own problems, and had done so successfully for 3 years, and did not need to hand them to someone else, simply because she had spent a few weeks in his company and felt things she had not planned to feel. She told herself all of this with great conviction. She spent the morning doing Hattie's laundry and the afternoon doing Hattie's mending, and she did both with the focused mechanical efficiency of a person using physical task as a dam against a flood. Clara found her in the back room at 4 in the afternoon, surrounded by mending and wearing an expression that Clara, who taught children for a living, and had spent years learning to read what faces were actually saying, apparently found immediately legible. "Something happened," Clara said, not a question. "Nothing happened. I'm mending." "You've sewn that same seam 3 times. Grace looked down. She had in fact sewn the same seam 3 times. She set the shirt down. "I got a letter this morning," she said, "from someone in Cincinnati." Clara sat down across her and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing to do. Grace looked at the shirt in her lap and decided in the particular way that decisions happen when you have been not deciding something for too long to say it out loud. "His name is Daniel Marsh. He's a lawyer. He was my employer in Cincinnati, and then he was something else." She pressed her hands flat on the fabric. "He is the kind of man who believes that when a woman leaves without permission, it constitutes an unresolved debt. And he is very patient and very thorough about collecting on what he believes he's owed." Clara's face did exactly what it did when she was controlling a strong reaction in front of students. Not blank, but contained. Carefully, thoughtfully contained. "He's coming here. Within the month. He says he has business interests in Montana." Grace's voice was level. "I believe the business interests are me." "Grace." Clara leaned forward. "You need to tell Luke." Luke has Beaumont to deal with. Luke has Beaumont and can handle hearing about one more problem. He's not a man with a limited capacity for difficulty. I know what he is. The words came out sharper than she intended. She breathed. I know, that's not the reason. Then what is? Grace was quiet. The reason, the real one, was something she had not yet put into words, even to herself. The reason was that she had spent 3 weeks allowing herself to matter to Luke Harrison, to be seen by him, to be stood beside, to feel the specific warmth of being known without being owned. And Daniel Marsh's letter was a reminder that she came with consequences. That choosing her meant choosing what followed her. And she was not certain she had the right to ask that of anyone, least of all, a man who was already standing against Beaumont alone. It's complicated, she said. Clara looked at her steadily. It always is. Tell him anyway. She did not tell him that day. She did not tell him the next day either. What she did instead was what she had always done when the world closed in. She moved. Not geographically, not yet, but internally, pulling herself back from the edges of the thing she had let herself feel, rebuilding the careful distance that had kept her functional for 3 years, checking her bag, checking Smoke's shoes. Beginning in the back of her mind, the old familiar calculation of roads and weather and distances. Luke noticed. Of course Luke noticed. He was a man who noticed things that were trying not to be noticed, and Grace pulling back from him was about as subtle as a storm front. He came to the boarding house on the second evening. She was in the front room, ostensibly reading one of Clara's books, actually staring at the same page she had been staring at for 20 minutes, and he came in and looked at her and sat down across from her without invitation and said, "What happened? Not what happened to you. Not are you all right. Just what happened." An acknowledgement that something had, and a statement that he was ready to hear it. She set the book down. "A letter came," she said, "from Cincinnati." He waited. "The man I left Ohio because of. He's coming west." She kept her eyes on the table between them. "Within the month. He says he has business interests." She heard Luke's stillness change, not movement. The opposite, a specific quality of very deliberate, not moving. "What kind of man?" he asked. "Powerful, patient." She looked up. "The kind of man who considers a woman who left him without permission to be a legal and moral problem requiring correction." The muscle in Luke's jaw. "Did he hurt you?" Did. Not a question. A verification. And she understood the difference. He was not asking because he didn't believe her. He was asking because the specific nature of the injury mattered to what he did next. "Not the way you mean," she said. "He was never, it wasn't that." She pressed her hands together. "He controlled everything. My wages, my movements, who I spoke to, where I was permitted to go. He called it protection, and I was 24, and I believed him for 2 years." She paused. "When I understood what it actually was, I took what was mine, and I left. He reported me to the sheriff there as a thief. I had taken my own wages that he had been holding, but his word carried more than mine." Luke's expression did not change, but something behind it did, a tightening, a compression. The look of a man absorbing something that has made him angry in a way that is going to last. "The letter in your bag," he said. "The one you've never opened." She stared at him. "How do you know about that?" "You touched it once when we were working on the documents, picked it up and put it back. The way someone handles something they're afraid of but can't throw away." Grace looked at this man who saw things and said them and did not pretend he hadn't seen them. "It's from him," she said. "He sent it 6 months after I left. I've been carrying it for 2.5 years. You don't have to open it." "I know. But you're going to." She was quiet for a moment. Eventually, Luke leaned forward, his forearms on the table, and looked at her with the direct, steady look that meant he was saying something he had decided was important enough to say carefully. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "This changes nothing about where I stand with you. If this man comes to Black Hollow with the intention of pressuring you or causing you harm, he is going to find that you are not alone. That is not negotiable." Grace felt the words land the way things land, when they are exactly what you needed to hear and exactly what you were afraid to need. You don't have to. I know I don't. He held her gaze. I'm telling you, not asking. She breathed. He's going to use Beaumont, she said. If he has business interests in Montana that brought him here specifically, he's going to connect to Beaumont. Men like Marsh always find men like Beaumont. They understand each other. Luke's expression shifted. She saw the calculation move through it. The reassessment, the map of the problem redrawn with a new element added. You think Beaumont told him where you were? I think it's possible. She pressed her hands flat on the table. I think a man with Beaumont's resources who found out a woman named Grace Sullivan was helping draft legal complaints against him might have found it useful to find out who Grace Sullivan was. The silence that followed had weight. If that's true, Luke said slowly, then Marsh isn't coming here just for you. He's coming because Beaumont wants him here. Two men applying pressure from two directions at once. At the woman they both have leverage over. She said it plainly without self-pity, because it was simply an accurate strategic description, and she had learned long ago that looking at the problem clearly was the only way to solve it. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. You told me when you were ready. He stood up. I need to talk to Deputy Coulter tonight. If Beaumont is bringing in outside help, Coulter needs to know before it arrives. Luke. She stood too. If this goes badly, if Marsh arrives and Beaumont moves at the same time, I need you to understand that I am not going to be a liability. I'm not going to hide and wait for things to happen around me. He looked at her. I know that, he said. I mean it. I'm done hiding. I know that too. A pause, and something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, but was related to something that came from a place of genuine warmth. That's exactly what worries me. Deputy Sam Coulter was 23 and had the face of a boy who had decided to be serious about things, which meant he looked young and earnest and slightly alarmed by most conversations. He was also, as Luke had said, genuinely honest, the particular honesty of someone who had not yet been given enough reason to become otherwise, which made him valuable in the specific way that uncorrupted things are valuable in a corrupted system. He came to the boarding house the next morning, at Luke's request, sat at Hattie's front table, and listened to everything Grace told him with the focused attention of a man who understood he was being given information that mattered. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. So Beaumont's working with a man from Cincinnati, Coulter said. A lawyer. Potentially, Luke said. We don't have confirmation yet. You've got the legal complaints already filed with the land office. Filed and documented. Grace has copies. Coulter looked at Grace. Do you have anything in writing connecting Marsh to you? Anything with his name and the specific claims he made? She thought about it. The sheriff's report from Cincinnati. He filed a theft complaint. My name is on it. That's in his favor. His claim is false. I have wage records. I kept copies. She paused. I always kept copies of everything. I worked for a lawyer long enough to know that documentation is the only evidence that doesn't change its story. Coulter looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating. Okay, he said. If Marsh arrives in this county and attempts to use that report as grounds for anything, an arrest, a removal, any formal action, I need to see those wage records first, before anything moves. He leaned forward. The sheriff won't help you. You know that. I know. But I can slow things down. I can require process. I can make sure nothing happens fast, and sometimes slow is enough. Sometimes, Luke said, it's what I've got. Coulter looked between them. I need you both to understand if Beaumont and this Marsh move together, even slowing things down might not be enough. These letters to the land office need a response before that happens. They need a response yesterday, Grace said. Then we need to push. He stood. I have a cousin who clerks at the federal land office in Helena. I can send a wire today. He looked at Grace. You draft it. Something short and specific. I'll sign my name to it. Grace nodded. After Coulter left, Hattie came out of the kitchen with coffee and set it on the table between them, and Grace had the brief, dizzying sensation of having more people on her side in this room than she had had anywhere in the previous 3 years combined. She wrapped her hands around the cup. All right, she said. "All right," Luke answered. The wire to Helena went out that afternoon. 2 days later, the reply came back. Not the full response they needed, but a confirmation that the complaint had been received, that a review was in process, and that a federal land agent would be dispatched to Black Hollow Valley within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Coulter brought the wire directly to the boarding house. Grace read it twice, then handed it to Luke, who read it once, nodded, and looked out the window with the expression of a man adjusting his calculations. 2 weeks is tight, he said. It's something, Coulter said. Everything depends on whether Marsh gets here before or after the agent does. Grace looked at the wire. We assume before. Plan for before. If the agent arrives first, we've lost nothing. If Marsh arrives first and we're not prepared, we lose everything. Both men looked at her. She did not find this remarkable. What do we need to have in place before he arrives? What they needed was a complete documentation package. Every deed, every survey record, every dated piece of correspondence, organized and witnessed, and ready to present to a federal agent in a format that made the fraud being committed against Luke's land claim undeniable. What they also needed was Grace's own documentation, the wage records, the timeline of her employment and departure from Cincinnati, the evidence that Daniel Marsh's claim against her was false. She had never assembled it all in one place before. She had kept the pieces separate, a habit of a caution. If one piece was found, the others were still safe. But separate pieces told a fragmented story, and fragmented stories gave powerful men room to construct different narratives. She spent 3 days at Hattie's table assembling it. Luke came every evening and sat across from her, and they worked in the companionable silence of two people engaged in parallel labor, and sometimes they talked about the documents, about the land, about what the federal agent would need to see, and in what order, and sometimes they didn't, and the not talking had become something she relied on without having decided to. On the second evening, Clara came down late and found them both still working, and said nothing, but brought a lamp and set it between them and went back upstairs, and Grace watched her go and thought about the quiet accumulation of small acts of care, the way they added up to something without ceremony or announcement. She thought about what Luke had said on the ridge, that staying was how you accumulated the knowing of a place, that you couldn't take it with you. She thought that maybe the same was true of people, that you couldn't take the knowing with you either, that staying was the only way to earn it. On the fourth night, the trouble arrived ahead of schedule. She heard it first, voices in the street below, raised, and then a sound she had learned to identify before she could fully articulate why she knew it. The particular thud of something heavy, striking something that gave. She was at the window in seconds. 3 men in the street below. Not Beaumont's usual messengers. These were different. Bigger, the kind of men hired for a specific category of work that had nothing to do with legal pressure or social persuasion. They were at the door of the stable across the street where Smoke was boarded, and one of them had something in his hand that in the light of the street lantern looked very much like a length of chain. Grace's mind made the calculation in under 2 seconds. They were not there for Luke's property documents. They were there for Smoke. She did not think about it further. She grabbed her coat, her knife, and her boots, and was on the back stairs before she had fully decided to be moving in the dark with the fast, silent efficiency of someone who had spent 3 years learning to move in exactly this way, and for the first time in 3 years was furious about having needed to learn it. She came around the side of the stable from the back alley and heard as she came one of the men's voices, low, professional, the tone of someone who does not expect to be interrupted. "Get the gray one. She's what Harrison rides when he comes to town. Take her out the back. Easy." Grace stepped through the side door of the stable. "Get away from that horse." 3 men turned. She had the knife out. She was aware that a knife against 3 men was not a favorable ratio, and she was also aware that she had surprised them, which was worth something, and that she was between them and the door, and that the specific quality of her voice, flat, certain without the performance of bravery that frightened people made when they were frightened, had caused them to stop, which meant they were doing the calculation too. "Lady," the nearest one started, "I said get away from the horse." She kept her eyes on the middle one, biggest, therefore the one who would decide for the group. He was looking at her the way men like this looked at women who were not behaving according to the expected pattern, with the particular recalibration of someone who had planned for one thing and gotten another. "We're just moving a horse," he said. "You're stealing a horse. In Montana. I think we both know what that means legally." A pause. She heard boots on the street outside. The middleman heard it too. Luke came through the main stable door with a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other, and took in the scene in one practiced rapid assessment. Grace the knife. 3 men. The horses and his face did something controlled and specific that Grace had not seen before, a very precise narrowing, a man making a decision about how much of his anger to let show, and choosing the exact right amount. "Evening," he said. The 3 men looked between Luke and Grace and the rifle, and executed the calculation that men in their profession are trained to execute: opportunity versus consequence, and whether the current employer's orders were worth the current specific risk. The middleman stepped back from Smoke's stall. "We'll be going," he said. "You'll be going to Deputy Coulter's office," Luke said. "He's expecting visitors." He wasn't, but the men didn't know that. They went. Luke waited until the door closed, and then he let the rifle down, and Grace let the knife down, and they stood in the dim stable in the smell of hay and cold and nervous horse, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You came down alone," he said finally. "I was faster." "Grace." He set the lantern on the hook. 3 men. I know how many there were. I counted them from the window." She was shaking now, not from fear. From the aftermath of not being afraid, the body's delayed accounting. "They were going to take Smoke. It would have been a message, a way of telling you, telling both of us, that they could reach anything we cared about. You could have been hurt. So could Smoke." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to stand at a window and watch while people I care about are threatened. That is not who I am anymore." The word "anymore" landed between them, and she heard it, heard what it meant, heard the shape of the before and the after it contained. Luke crossed the stable in 3 steps. He took her face in both hands, his gloves still on warm leather against her cold cheeks, and looked at her with an expression that had stopped pretending to be anything other than what it was. "I know who you are," he said. "I've known since the first night." Her hands came up and held his wrists, not pulling away, just holding. Feeling the solidity of him, the realness of his hands on her face, the specific grounded weight of being here in this place, with this person. She was shaking. He was completely still. "Don't scare me like that again," he said, very quietly. Not a command, a confession. She looked up at him and thought about 3 years of running, and the letter in her bag, and Daniel Marsh coming west, and Beaumont, and the men who had just walked out of this stable, and all the reasons this was complicated and dangerous and probably ill-timed and possibly foolish. And then she thought about the ridge and the valley and what it meant to accumulate the knowing of a place. And she thought about how she had told him she was not going to hide and wait for things to happen around her anymore. She leaned forward and put her forehead against his chest. He wrapped both arms around her. Just that. No words. No performance. The specific, uncomplicated shelter of 2 people standing in a cold stable, deciding without ceremony that they were choosing each other. She stood there and breathed, and let herself be still for the first time in 3 years. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the stable walls, cold and indifferent, and full of the problems that would still be, and Marsh and the federal agent who hadn't arrived yet, and all the things that needed doing, and all the risks that hadn't fully played out. All of it was still there. But she was not running toward it alone. She told him that night, sitting in the empty stable with the horses settled and the lantern burning low between them, about Cincinnati. Not the version she had given Clara, the stripped, careful version, the whole version. She told him about being 23 and new to the city, and grateful to a man who offered her work and treated her initially with a kind of regard that she had mistaken for respect, but had actually been something quite different. She told him about the slow narrowing. The way a controlling situation never arrived all at once, but always in small, reasonable-seeming increments, each one explainable on its own. The pattern only visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole shape of it, and by then you were usually in too deep to step back easily. She told him about the wages held for safekeeping, about the letters that went out with her name on them that she had not written, about the evening she had gone to a social gathering and been told very pleasantly and very clearly that she had not had permission to go and that there would be a consequence for the lack of permission. She told him about the night she understood, not gradually, not in increments. In one specific crystalline moment, standing in the office where she worked, looking at a document that bore her signature, her actual handwriting, her actual name, authorizing a transfer of funds from an account she had not known existed in her name, and understanding that she had not signed it, and understanding what that meant, and understanding what it was going to mean when she left. She had taken the document. She had taken her wage records. She had taken the $38.50 she could verify, had been held from her pay over 14 months. She had taken nothing else. She had left at 4 in the morning on foot with a bag she could carry and a plan that lasted only as far as the first stage out of Cincinnati. Luke listened to all of it without speaking. When she finished, the silence held for a long time. "The unopened letter," he said. "I don't know what's in it." She looked at her hands. "I've imagined every possible thing. That's probably worse than whatever it actually says. You want to open it now?" She thought about it. She went upstairs and came back with it, the letter creased from years of handling, soft at the folds from carrying. She sat back down and held it, and thought about the ridge and the valley, and the solid ground she had been building for 3 weeks, and the man sitting across from her who had not flinched at a single word of what she'd just told him. She opened it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was a formal demand for the return of the $38.50 couched in language that implied criminality. The second was a personal appeal, tone shifted softer, the language of a man who believed that warmth and menace could coexist in the same paragraph if you were careful about the sequencing. The third was a single sentence. "You will find that the world is smaller than you imagine, and I am more patient than you remember." Grace read it twice, folded it, set it on the table between them. "That's it," she said. Luke looked at the folded letter. "He wrote that 2.5 years ago," he said, "and now he's coming." He said he was patient. He underestimated how far west small world goes. Luke picked up the letter, not opening it, just holding it. "This is evidence of his intentions, his pattern of behavior. It goes in the documentation package." Grace stared at him. "It's been in your bag for 2.5 years doing nothing," he said. "Now it does something." She watched him set the letter with the other documents precisely in the correct order, with the date marked, and felt something release in her chest. Something she had been holding closed around that letter for so long, she had stopped noticing the effort it cost to hold it. "Luke." He looked up. She didn't have words for what she wanted to say. She had been verbal, her whole life had used language as a tool and a shield and a weapon when needed, but what she felt in that moment did not have language. It had weight and warmth, and the terrifying, specific, real texture of something she had not felt since before she understood what could be taken from her. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that in the cooling stable, with the lantern burning low, and the mountain dark outside, and all the things that were still coming, still coming. And Grace Sullivan thought, this is solid ground. This right here. This is what staying feels like. And for the first time in 3 years, she was not afraid of it. That solid ground, that staying, that hand held in the low lamplight of a cold Montana stable, and she let herself have it without apology, without the old instinct to pull back before something good could be taken from her. And that was the bravest thing Grace Sullivan had done in longer than she could remember. Daniel Marsh arrived on a Thursday. Grace knew before she saw him. She knew the way animals know weather. Something changed in the quality of the air, in the particular tension that ran through Black Hollow Valley. The morning the eastbound stage came in carrying a passenger who stepped down onto the frozen Main Street with a leather case in one hand, and the deliberate, unhurried ease of a man who had never once in his life worried about where he was going to sleep. She was at Hattie's front window when he stepped down. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing about men. Like Daniel Marsh. They did not age the way ordinary people aged, worn by consequence and weather, and the accumulated cost of choices. They aged the way money aged slowly, and with a kind of preserved authority that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with never having been touched by the things they put other people through. His hair was silver at the temples now, more than she remembered, and he had added the kind of settled weight that came from years of good meals, but the face was the same. The particular set of the jaw, the precise and professional pleasantness of the expression, the eyes that moved through a room, the way a man's eyes move when he already owns the room and is just verifying the inventory. His eyes moved down the street. They did not stop at the boarding house window, but Grace stepped back anyway. Old reflex, bone deep. She stood with her back against the wall and breathed through her nose and felt the old fear arrive in her body. Not the sharp, sudden fear of immediate danger, but the deep structural fear of a pattern, of a force you have already measured and found to be stronger than you thought you were, and the specific cold of watching that force walk calmly into the same town where you had started for the first time in 3 years to believe in something. She gave herself 60 seconds. She counted them. Then she went downstairs and told Hattie, "He's here." Hattie set down the dish she was drying and looked at Grace with the steady, unperturbed calm of a woman who had managed crises across 6 decades and had learned that the first thing panic did was make itself useful to whoever was causing the problem. "Then we're ready," Hattie said. And they were, because Grace had made sure of it. The documentation package was complete. 3 copies, one with Grace, one with Luke, one left in a sealed envelope with Deputy Coulter, with instructions to open it only if something happened to prevent Grace from opening it herself. The wage records, the letter from Marsh, the timeline, the land documents. Every piece of paper that told the true version of the story, organized and witnessed and dated and cross-referenced, so that it formed not just evidence, but a narrative. And narrative was what courts responded to, and what public opinion remembered. And Grace had worked in a law office long enough to know the difference between having the truth and being able to make the truth visible. She had also quietly, and with the specific foresight of someone who had been burned by trusting the wrong institutions, sent a copy of the Cincinnati documentation to a lawyer in Helena, whose name Coulter had given her, a man named Aldridge, who had a reputation for taking cases that embarrassed powerful people, which was the closest thing to righteous motivation Grace was willing to count on. Luke knew about Aldridge. He had helped her draft that letter. He had not told her what to do. He had never told her what to do. He had sat at the table and helped her think through the structure of the argument, offered the specific kind of feedback that came from a man who had fought a bank and a land claim and several years of being underestimated, and he had trusted her to know what she was building and why. That trust had mattered more than she had words for. She was thinking about it now, standing in Hattie's kitchen, waiting for the inevitable knock on the door, because she knew Daniel Marsh, and Daniel Marsh did not waste time on surveillance or subtlety once he had confirmed a location. He came directly. He had always come directly. It was, in its horrible way, one of his better qualities. At least you always knew exactly when he had decided to move. The knock came at 10:30. Hattie answered it. Grace heard the exchange from the kitchen. Hattie's voice even, and unhurried, and Marsh's voice, pleasant and certain, and the specific social performance of a man who used charm as a first tool because it cost nothing and occasionally worked. It did not work on Hattie Drummond. "I'm afraid Miss Sullivan isn't receiving visitors this morning," Hattie said with the serenity of a woman who has been turning unwanted men away from her door for 40 years and has never once found it difficult. "You're welcome to leave your card." A pause. "Mrs. Drummond." His voice had adjusted, still pleasant, but with an edge, now the edge of someone whose first tool has been declined and is reaching for the second. "I've traveled a considerable distance. My business with Miss Sullivan is time-sensitive and legal in nature. I'm sure she would want a great many things that aren't your business to be sure about." Hattie's voice had not changed in pitch or temperature by a single degree. "Good morning, Mr. Marsh." The door closed. Grace let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like several years. She came out of the kitchen and looked at Hattie, who had already turned back to her dishwashing, with the calm demeanor of someone who had accomplished nothing more remarkable than taking out the trash. "He'll be back," Grace said. "Of course he will." Hattie set a plate on the rack. But now he knows this house isn't open to him. That matters. It did matter. It was a small thing, a door, a sentence a morning, but it was the kind of small thing that set a tone, and tones mattered in small towns, where everyone was watching, and the story being told about what was happening was sometimes as important as what was actually happening. Grace went upstairs, put on her coat, and went to find Luke. Howe was at the east fence line where he'd been working since daybreak. He came in from the cold when she arrived, read her face in one look and said, "He's here." "Since this morning." She told him about the knock, about Hattie, about Marcia's voice doing its precise adjustment from charm to pressure in 3 sentences. "He'll go to Beaumont next. They'll coordinate. Probably already have." Luke took his gloves off and pushed his hands through his hair. The first genuinely unsettled physical gesture she had seen from him, and she noted it because it was rare. "Coulter wired me this morning. The federal land agent has been delayed. Another week, maybe 10 days. Grace felt the information land like a weight. So we're without the agent, with Beaumont and Marsh in the same town, and the sheriff in Beaumont's pocket. That's the situation. She stood with it for a moment, turned it over, looked at its edges. What does Beaumont do when a legal challenge is working against him and he's running out of time? She asked. Luke's jaw set. He stops being legal about it. Which means the next move isn't paperwork. No. When? Soon. He looked at her directly. I need you to stay in town, close to Hattie's. I know you don't want to hear that. I'm not going to hide in the boarding house. I'm not asking you to hide. His voice was steady. No anger, just the clear force of someone saying something important. I'm asking you to stay where there are witnesses. Because if Marsh tries to move against you directly, he's going to do it somewhere there's no one watching. That's how men like him operate. A pause. And because if something happens to me, I need you in a position to finish what we've started. Not on a back road somewhere. She stared at him. She wanted to argue. She had the argument ready. She was not going to be sidelined. She was not going to be managed. She had spent 3 years surviving without anyone, and she was not going to become someone who needed protecting now of all times. But he had said, finish what we've started. Not protect yourself. Not stay safe. Finish it. He was not telling her to step back. He was telling her where she was most useful. All right, she said. He nodded once. I'm going to the ranch. There are things on the property that need to be secured before tonight. I want the deed and the survey originals in the ground, not the tin box. If men come to the ranch looking for reasons, I don't want to give them one. Coulter. Coulter knows I'm going. He'll check in tonight. Luke picked up his gloves again. If you don't hear from me by dark, you go to Coulter, not the sheriff. Coulter. Luke. Precaution. He looked at her, and the look was everything. The look always was steady and direct, and carrying more than the words did the particular language of a man who said important things in simple sentences, because he trusted the person he was saying them to understand the full weight. I'll be back before dark. She crossed the distance between them and put a hand on his chest, flat, deliberate, feeling his heartbeat through the layers of coat and shirt, solid and even and real. Be careful, she said. He put his hand over hers. Always am, he said. She knew that was almost true and trusted the almost. I was not back before dark. She knew at 5 o'clock, an hour before sundown, from the specific quality of his absence. Not merely the fact of it, but the feeling of it. The way the air in the town had changed, the way Coulter had walked past the boarding house twice in the last hour without stopping. The way Hattie had started a pot of coffee at 4:30 without being asked, as though she were bracing for something. At 5:15, Coulter knocked. Grace was at the door before Hattie could reach it. Tell me, she said. Coulter's face had the expression of a young man carrying news he did not want to carry. 3 of Beaumont's men were seen riding toward the East Range about 2 hours ago, armed. Grace's hand gripped the doorframe. And Luke? He hadn't come back into town when I checked the road at 4. Coulter held her gaze. There's no smoke from the ranch. That's a good sign. It means nothing's burning. But I can't raise him. She thought about what Luke had said. If you don't hear from me by dark, go to Coulter. It was not yet dark, but it was close enough. I need a horse, she said. Grace, I need a horse and I need you to come with me, and I need to leave in the next 5 minutes. She was already turning back into the house for her coat. He could be injured. He could be pinned down. He could be... She stopped herself, breathed. He told me to come to you. I came to you. Now I'm asking you to come with me. Coulter looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he put his hat back on. 5 minutes. The ride to the East Range was 20 minutes in the cold dark. Grace on Smoke Coulter, on his own horse moving fast along the trail that Grace had learned well enough in the past weeks to follow without the lantern until they got close enough to the property that light would announce them before they knew what they were announcing themselves to. She heard it before she saw it. Voices, not the specific words, just the shape of a confrontation, the particular compression of sound that came from men standing close and speaking with the controlled force of people who had not yet started hitting each other but were close to it. She put her hand up. Coulter stopped. They came around the last stand of Pine on Foot, leading the horses, and she saw the yard of Luke's ranch lit by 2 lanterns hung from the fence posts. 3 men on one side, and Luke on the other. And Luke was standing very still with his hands at his sides and the specific, deliberate calm of a man choosing his moment. One of the men had papers in his hand, an official-looking envelope. She knew immediately what it was. It was a fraudulent property notice. Beaumont's final move, not an offer, not pressure, but a manufactured legal claim. A document asserting a competing title to the East Range, backdated, forged, with enough technical authenticity to require time and money to disprove. By the time the truth was established, the damage would be done. Beaumont's men would have walked the property, documented their alleged claim, and the cloud on the title would be real enough to paralyze the federal review. It was clever. It was exactly the kind of clever that worked in the gap between when a federal agent was expected and when he arrived. Grace looked at the papers in the man's hand. She looked at Luke, who had not moved and had not reached for the rifle she could see leaning against the fence post 6 feet from his right hand. He had not reached for it because he was 3 against 1, and reaching for it would change the nature of the confrontation in a way that ended badly, regardless of who fired first. She understood this in under 2 seconds. She stepped out of the trees. That document is fraudulent. All 4 men turned. The man with the papers looked at her with the practiced blankness of someone who does not know who she is and is calculating whether that matters. Ma'am, this is a private property matter. I know what it is. She walked forward into the lantern light slowly enough to look unafraid and fast enough to show she meant business. That document was not recorded at the county clerk's office before today because it did not exist before today. I checked the records 2 days ago. The Harrison East Range claim is uncontested and has been since 1879. She stopped 10 feet from the man with the papers. I also know that what you're attempting to do constitutes fraud under Montana territorial law, and that Deputy Coulter, she looked back toward the tree line, who is standing right there, is a witness. Coulter walked out of the trees with his hand on his holster. He did not draw. He didn't need to. He stood in the lantern light and let himself be seen, and the equation in the yard changed completely. The 3 men looked at each other. The man with the papers lowered them slightly, not putting them away, not yet, but lowering them. We'll be back with the sheriff, he said. You're welcome to bring the sheriff, Grace said. Bring him to the county clerk's office, and we can all look at the records together. A long pause. Then the men left, not running, walking, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who have been told to do a job and have been interrupted but have not been defeated, who are going back to report and receive new instructions. And Grace watched them go and understood clearly that this was not over, and that Beaumont was going to move faster now, and that the next thing was coming and coming soon. But they were gone. And Luke was here. And he was not hurt. She walked to him, and he turned to face her. And his expression, when he looked at her, was the most complicated thing she had seen on a human face in years. Relief and something that was almost anger. Except the anger was not at her. She understood that immediately. It was the anger a person feels when someone they care about has walked into a dangerous situation because of them, which was a feeling she recognized because she had been trying to protect him from exactly the same thing for the last week. "I told you to stay in town," he said. "You told me to go to Coulter if you weren't back by dark. It wasn't dark yet." That's a technical reading of what I said. I'm a technically trained reader. He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light between them. Coulter giving them the courtesy of suddenly finding something important to look at in the other direction. "You knew what that document was," Luke said. "I worked in a law office. You called his bluff in front of 3 armed men. I called his fraud a fraud in front of a law officer." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." He shook his head. Not disagreement. Something else. The motion of a man absorbing something he can't argue with and isn't sure he should try. "Thank you," he said, quietly. The way he said things that mattered. "You would have done the same." "Not as fast." She almost smiled. "I've been practicing being fast." They rode back to town together, the 3 of them, and the cold was thorough and the dark was complete, and Grace rode between Luke and Coulter and thought about what had just happened and what was still coming and the specific shape of the next few days. Beaumont's fraudulent title claim had been witnessed and challenged. That was good. But it also meant Beaumont knew his legal maneuvering had been anticipated. He would move to something else. And Marsh was still in town. She had not forgotten Marsh. She thought about him while the horses walked where he would be. Now what he would be doing. How much he and Beaumont had already coordinated. She thought about the specific way his mind worked, which she had observed over 2 years of close proximity, and had mapped more carefully than she had ever told anyone. He was patient, but he was not passive. He waited for the right opening, and then he moved decisively. The right opening for Marsh was always the moment when the person he was pressuring believed the pressure had eased. She had not let herself believe the pressure had eased. She was not going to. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "I need to go to the county clerk's office and formally file an objection to any competing title claim on the Harrison East Range, on paper witnessed dated." "First thing," Coulter agreed. "I'll be there." "And Marsh?" "What about him?" Luke asked. "He hasn't made a direct move yet. He's been in town 2 days. That's longer than he usually waits." She turned this over. "He's waiting for something." "Beaumont to move first," Luke said. "Or for me to do something that gives him an opening." She paused. "He needs a reason to file the Cincinnati complaint here. Something that makes me look like I'm engaged in criminal activity so that his story about the wages becomes plausible. Can he file in Montana on a claim from Ohio? He can try. It would take time to disprove, and time is what he's buying." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Then we don't give him an opening." "That's what I'm thinking." "You stay visible. You stay in public spaces. You do everything in front of witnesses." He looked at her sideways. "Which means no more riding out to save people in the dark. That was one time. Once is a pattern with men like Marsh." She accepted this. It was true. She hated that it was true, but it was. Chate. The morning brought the thing she had not anticipated. She was at the county clerk's office with Coulter at 8 o'clock, filing the formal objection to the fraudulent title claim, when the door behind her opened, and she heard without turning around a voice she had been hearing in her memory for 3 years. "Grace," just her name, said pleasantly. The way he always said it, as if the familiarity were a given, as if the right to use her name without invitation were simply established, and she had agreed to this at some point she apparently couldn't recall. She turned slowly. Daniel Marsh stood in the doorway of the county clerk's office in Black Hollow Valley, Montana, in a good coat with a professional smile, and looked at her the way he had always looked at her, with an ownership so practiced it had become invisible to itself. The county clerk, a man named Hughes, was watching from behind his counter with the cautious expression of someone who understood that something was happening in his office and wasn't certain what. Coulter was at Grace's left shoulder. "Mr. Marsh," she said, perfectly level, the voice she had practiced in every town between Cincinnati and here. "It's good to see you." He stepped inside. I've been hoping for a moment to speak privately. This is as private as it's going to get." His eyes moved to Coulter, assessed, moved back to her. "I think there are things between us that would be better addressed without an audience." "I disagree." A small silence. His smile adjusted barely, but she saw it. She had spent 2 years learning to see it. "Grace." Lower now, the voice he used when pleasantness had run its course. "You have something that belongs to me. The circumstances of your departure were. I think you know they were not what they should have been. I've come a long way to resolve this quietly. I'd prefer not to involve the law." "The law is already involved," she indicated Coulter. "Deputy Coulter, this is Daniel Marsh. He is a lawyer from Cincinnati who has made a false report to the Cincinnati Sheriff's Office, claiming I stole wages that are demonstrably my own." She looked at Marsh. "I have the records. I have filed them with a lawyer in Helena. I have a copy here, and Deputy Coulter has a copy. And if you attempt to use the Cincinnati report as grounds for any legal action in this county, you will be making that attempt on the record in front of witnesses, with the contradicting evidence already filed." Marsh looked at her, not pleasantly anymore. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been thorough." She held his gaze. "Go home, Mr. Marsh. There's nothing here for you." A long silence. Marsh looked at her with the eyes of a man who has applied a specific kind of pressure for a specific number of years, and has just discovered that the thing he was pressing against has become something else entirely, something solid and rooted, and not apparently going to move. He looked at Coulter. He looked at Hughes the clerk, who had been writing very carefully in his ledger, and had also been listening to every word. He looked back at Grace. "We'll see," he said. He left. The door closed behind him. Grace let out a slow breath. Coulter beside her made a sound that was approximately admiration. "That was," he started. "Not over," she said. "That was not over. He's going to go straight to Beaumont." She turned to Hughes. "How fast can you process this filing?" Hughes, who had now entirely abandoned the pretense of not having listened, set down his pen. "End of day today. I need it done in an hour." He looked at her. He looked at Coulter. 45 minutes, he said. 45 minutes later, the objection was filed, stamped, recorded, and witnessed. 50 minutes after that, Luke arrived in town, having received Coulter's wire about Marsh at the clerk's office, and he came through the boarding house door with the controlled, rapid energy of a man who has been riding hard and is working to look like he hasn't, and the first thing he said when he saw Grace sitting at the table was, "Are you all right?" "I'm all right." She looked at him. I faced him. Something settled in Luke's expression. Not relief exactly. Something deeper. Pride, maybe. The specific, respectful pride of recognizing something in another person. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it exactly as it happened. He listened the same way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. Taking it in the way ground takes water, absorbing rather than deflecting. When she finished, he sat down across from her. "Beaumont is going to move today," he said. "If Marsh goes to him with this, Beaumont will know his time is limited. A man with a federal agent coming, and a fraudulent claim on record, and a legal objection filed, doesn't have many moves left. He's going to reach for the ugliest one." "What's the ugliest one?" Luke's jaw set. "He's going to try to scare us off the property. Not legal pressure, physical." She absorbed this. "Tonight. Probably tonight. He won't wait." He looked at his hands, then at her. "I'm not going to ask you to stay behind this time." She blinked. "I'm asking you to come," he said. "Because it's your fight as much as mine, and I'm done pretending otherwise." He met her eyes. "And because I'd rather have you where I can see you than wondering where you are." Grace looked at this man, this complicated, specific, extraordinary man, and felt everything she had spent 3 years protecting herself from feeling, and felt it without flinching. "When?" she said. "Coulter's coming at sundown. I've sent word to Gus and 2 other ranchers, downstream men with a stake in the water rights. They'll be there." "How many do you think Beaumont sends?" Enough to look serious, not enough to actually want the fight that follows. He paused. He wants us to run. That's always been what he wants. He doesn't want the legal aftermath of actual violence against documented witnesses. So we don't run. We don't run. She nodded. Outside, the afternoon was failing toward evening, the light going thin and cold, the way Montana light did, without ceremony, as if darkness were simply the next appointment, and it intended to keep it. Grace sat at Hattie's table with Luke across from her, and felt the particular quality of the hours before a thing, the compressed specific weight of time when you know what's coming and are as prepared as you're going to be, and the only thing left is the waiting. She reached into her pocket and put the folded letter on the table between them. Not Marcia's letter. The other one. The letter she had kept to herself, the one she had written 3 months ago in a town in Colorado, addressed to herself the accounting she had made in a bad week of everything she had lost, and everything she still was, and everything she intended to find. She had not shown it to anyone. She showed it to him now, not to explain it, just to set it on the table and say, "This is mine, this is real, this is part of what I'm standing on." He looked at it without reaching for it. "You wrote it to yourself," he said, "when I was trying to remember who I was." She smoothed the fold. "I carry it the way you keep the deed. Not because I need to read it every day, because it exists." He looked at her with that look, the one she had come to know as the fullest version of his attention. The look that saw without performing, that held without gripping. "You knew who you were," he said, "even when you were running." She thought about that. She thought about the woman who had carried a knife under her pillow, and a letter she couldn't open, and a plan that only reached as far as the next stage depot. And she thought about whether that woman had known who she was, or whether she had just been holding the shape of herself together long enough to find out. "I knew what I was capable of," she said. "I wasn't always sure it was enough. It was always enough." He said it without drama, the way he said everything true. "You just needed room to find out." She held his gaze. "You gave me that," she said. "No." He shook his head. "You gave yourself that. I just didn't get in the way." Hattie came in from the kitchen at that exact moment with a pot of coffee and the serene, unhurried dignity of a woman who was absolutely not interrupting anything important, and set it between them and walked back out. And Grace thought about how some people expressed love through coffee in the late afternoon when things were hard, and how that was not a small thing, and how Black Hollow Valley was full of that particular kind of not small thing, and how she had almost ridden away from it in the dark on a borrowed horse and never known what she was leaving. She poured 2 cups, handed one to Luke. They sat together in the last of the daylight and drank coffee and waited for evening. And Grace Sullivan felt underneath the fear and the readiness and the full knowledge of what was coming. Something she had not felt in longer than she could measure. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, sitting in the last of the daylight with Luke Harrison across from her and coffee between them and everything that was coming, still coming. And for the first time in 3 years, that feeling did not frighten her, but steadied her. The way solid ground steadies a person who has been standing on moving water for so long, they had forgotten what still felt like. Beaumont's men came at 9 o'clock. Not 3 this time. 7. Riding in from the North Road in a group that made no effort at concealment, because concealment was no longer the point. The point was presence. The point was number. The point was the specific message that 7 armed men on a property at 9 o'clock in the evening sent without saying a word, that the time for documents and deputies and formal objections was finished. And what came next was the language that predated courts. Grace heard them from inside the ranch house. Luke was already at the door. Coulter was at the fence line to the left with Gus and 2 other downstream ranchers. 4 men total, which was not 7, but 4 men who knew this land and had a stake in what happened to it, which counted for something that pure number didn't capture. Grace took her place at the window with the documentation case in her hands. Not as a weapon, as a statement. She was the record. She was the witness. Whatever happened in the next hour, she was going to see it and know it and be able to say exactly what it was. The lead rider stopped at the fence post. Big man, heavy coat, Beaumont's brand on his saddle, the kind of professional that cost real money, which told Grace something about how seriously Beaumont was taking this, now that the legal moves had been blocked. "Harrison." The voice carried clear in the cold. "Mr. Beaumont is prepared to make one final offer. Tonight. Sign the transfer and you ride out with enough to start over clean. Don't sign and this gets complicated." Luke stood in the yard with his hands at his sides and his voice perfectly even. "My answer was no 3 weeks ago. My answer is no right now. If Mr. Beaumont would like to discuss this further, he's welcome to do it in front of the federal land agent when he arrives." A pause. "The agent isn't here yet." "He will be." Another pause, longer this time. The lead rider looked at the fence line where Coulter and the ranchers were visible, rifles, not raised but present. He was counting. He was recalculating. Grace watched him recalculate and understood that this was the moment, the pivot point, where the evening could go one of two ways, and the deciding factor was whether Beaumont's man believed that the noise and consequence of forcing the issue outweighed whatever Beaumont was paying. She opened the door and walked out. Luke turned his head sharply. She walked to stand beside him, not behind him, not in front of him, beside him, and she looked at the lead rider and said clearly, and without any performance of calm, because she didn't need to perform it, "My name is Grace Sullivan. I'm a legal correspondent, working on behalf of Mr. Harrison's land claim. This conversation, including your presence on this property at this hour, is being documented and will be included in the complaint currently under federal review." She held up the documentation case. "Every man on this property tonight is a named witness in a federal proceeding. I'd think carefully about that before anyone does anything that can't be undone." The lead rider looked at her. He looked at the documentation case. He looked at Coulter. He looked at the 7 men behind him who were looking at each other with the specific expression of hired men, performing the calculation between employer loyalty and personal legal exposure. He pulled his horse around. "We're done tonight," he said to his men, and they left. The yard went quiet. The specific ringing quiet of aftermath, not peace, not yet, but the absence of immediate danger, which was its own kind of relief. Gus let out a breath loud enough to hear across the yard. One of the other ranchers said something low and emphatic that Grace didn't catch, but understood from the tone. Coulter walked over, his hand off his holster, now his young face carrying the combined weight of relief and the particular seriousness of a man who understood that what had just happened was not an ending. "They'll go back to Beaumont," Coulter said. "Yes." Luke had not moved from beside Grace. "And Beaumont is out of moves. Men who are out of moves do unpredictable things. Some do." Luke looked at the road where the riders had gone. "Beaumont's not unpredictable. He's calculating. He's been calculating this for 2 years, and tonight his calculation came up against something he didn't factor in." He paused. "Witnesses. Documentation. Men with a stake in the outcome. He planned for one man standing alone. He didn't plan for this." Grace looked at the men around them. Coulter, Gus, the ranchers, and thought about what Luke had said on the ridge about the knowing of a place. The way staying accumulated things. The way you built slowly and without ceremony, the specific kind of wealth that couldn't be bought and couldn't be taken because it lived in people, in the fabric of who stood beside you when standing beside you cost something. Luke had been building that for years. She had stumbled into it by staying one night. She had earned a piece of it by choosing to stay after that. "What happens now?" Gus asked. "Now we wait for the agent," Coulter said. "He'll be here inside the week. With tonight documented, Beaumont's title claim flagged, and Marsh's complaint contradicted on the record. It's not a sure thing, but it's the best position we've been in." "And Beaumont just accepts that?" one of the ranchers asked. "Beaumont accepts what he can't change," Luke said. "He's a man who understands costs. Right now, the cost of continuing this is higher than the cost of losing." He looked at Coulter. "As long as the federal review goes the way the evidence says it should go." "It will." Coulter said it with the quiet certainty of a young man who had not yet learned to doubt the law, but had decided to enforce it as if it were reliable, which was nearly the same thing in practice. "I'll make sure of it." Tap-tap. They did not leave the ranch that night. Gus and the other ranchers rode back at midnight, satisfied that nothing more was coming before morning. Coulter stayed until 2, walking the fence line, checking the road, doing the methodical work of a man who believed that thoroughness was its own kind of protection. Grace and Luke sat by the fire inside, not talking much, not needing to. The silence between them, the comfortable kind that had no empty space in it, the kind that two people earned through enough shared difficulty to stop needing to fill it. At some point, Grace realized she had not thought about leaving in 4 days. Not once. She had thought about documentation and filing deadlines and Beaumont's movements and Marsh's strategy and what Coulter needed and what Luke needed and what Gus and the ranchers downstream needed. And she had thought about all of it as a person thinks about the problems of their own life, not as a visitor managing someone else's crisis. And she sat with the fire and understood what that meant. Luke across from her said nothing about it. He was watching the fire, and she was watching the fire, and the ranch was quiet around them. And the Montana night was the Montana night, indifferent and enormous and cold, and none of it felt threatening. It felt like the world, just the world that you lived in when you stayed somewhere long enough to recognize it as yours. "I'm not going to Ridgecrest," Grace said. It came out easily. No drama in it. Just a fact being stated. Luke turned his head to look at her. "No," he said. Not surprise, not triumph. Just an acknowledgement, one fact meeting another. "I don't know exactly what I'm doing instead," she said. "I haven't thought that far." "You don't have to have thought that far. I have skills that are useful here. The documentation, the letters, the legal work." Coulter said there are other ranchers in the county who need that kind of help. People who don't know how to fight the Beaumonts of the world with their own tools. Luke was quiet, listening the way he always listened. "I'm not staying because of you," she said. Then, "That's not entirely true. You're part of it." She looked at him directly. "But I'm staying because I looked at that valley from the ridge and something happened in my face that I didn't expect, and you saw it before I did, and I think I owe it to myself to find out what that was." He held her gaze for a long moment. "That's a good reason," he said. "It's an honest one." "Same thing coming from you." She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "I'm also staying," she said more quietly. "Because I'm tired. Not the bad kind. The kind that comes from having fought a long time and finally found a place where the fighting feels like it's for something." Luke set down his cup. He crossed the room and sat beside her, not close enough to press, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the way you feel a fire that you've moved near deliberately. He didn't touch her. He just sat with her, present in the specific, serious way that was the most characteristic thing about him. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask. Not tonight." He looked at the fire. "After the agent comes and the review is settled and Beaumont has made his peace with losing and Marsh has gone back to Cincinnati, after the dust is done." He turned to look at her. "I want to ask you something when there's nothing pressing on either side of it. When it's just a question." Grace looked at him and understood exactly what the question was going to be, and felt her chest do the complicated, terrifying, entirely wonderful thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in the past weeks. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and they sat by the fire and let that be enough for tonight. The federal land agent arrived 6 days later. His name was Briggs, a compact, efficient man in his 40s who wore his authority the way men wear clothes. They've had long enough to forget about naturally without adjustment. He came with a wire from Helena confirming his mandate, a set of federal land survey tools, and the particular focused energy of a man who had been sent to settle something and intended to do so before the next meal. He went first to the county clerk, then to Coulter, then, with both of them, to the ranch. Grace was there when he arrived. She was there because she had prepared the documentation he was going to need to see, and because the documentation was complex enough that having the person who organized it present was simply practical, and because Briggs was a federal agent, and federal agents responded to competence, and she had competence, and she intended to use it. She walked him through the package in 40 minutes at Luke's kitchen table. Deed records, say, dates the water rights documentation, the fraudulent title claim that had been filed, and immediately countered the witness statements from the night Beaumont's men came to the ranch. The correspondence with Beaumont's lawyer going back 8 months. Briggs read everything without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. "Who put this together?" "I did," Grace said. He looked at her with the assessing professional look of a man recalibrating. "You have legal training." 2 years in a law office in Cincinnati. He looked at Luke. "She work for you." "She works with me," Luke said. The distinction deliberate, and Briggs heard it. "All right." Briggs closed the folder. "This is thorough. Whoever Beaumont has working for him is going to have a hard time with this in review." He tapped the folder. "The fraudulent title claim is particularly useful. That's not just a losing argument, that's evidence of bad faith. It changes the posture of the whole proceeding." Grace said nothing. She let the work speak. "The review will take 10 days in Helena," Briggs said. "I'll need copies of everything." "I have 3 sets," Grace said, and placed them on the table. Briggs looked at the 3 sets. Looked at Grace. Something moved in his expression that was close to approval. "I'll be in touch," he said. Marsh left Black Hollow Valley on the same day Briggs arrived, which Grace took to be information rather than coincidence. She did not see him go. She heard it from Clara, who had been told by Hattie, who had been told by the woman at the general store, which was the specific communication network of a small town operating at full capacity. He had taken the morning stage east without speaking to anyone, carrying his leather case and his professional pleasantness and the particular silence of a man who has assessed the situation and found it not worth the continued expense. His Cincinnati complaint was on record and contradicted. The Helena lawyer Aldridge had acknowledged receipt of her documentation. There was nothing for Marsh in Black Hollow except costs, and Marsh was above all things a man who understood costs. Grace heard the news and felt nothing dramatic. She had expected rage or relief, or the particular lightness of a threat removed. What she felt instead was quieter than any of those. A kind of settling the sensation of a weight she had been holding for 3 years, finally making contact with solid ground and resting there. Not released. Rested. Still hers. But no longer suspended. She was sitting at Hattie's table when Clara told her. She sat for a moment after Clara left. Then she reached into her pocket and took out the accounting letter, the one she had written to herself in Colorado, the one she had put on the table in front of Luke the night before everything broke open. She unfolded it and read it all the way through for the first time since she had written it. It was not a particularly beautiful letter. It was the writing of a woman in a bad week trying to remind herself of things she was afraid of forgetting, her own name as something she chose, not something she had been given. Her own competence as a fact rather than a performance. Her own right to want things as real and not frivolous. She read it all the way through, folded it, put it in the documentation case with the wage records and the deed copies and all the other things that told the true version of the story. It belonged there. It was evidence, too. The review from Helena came back in 9 days, not 10. Coulter brought the wire to the boarding house at 7 in the morning, knocked and stood in the doorway with the expression of a young man trying not to show how pleased he was, and not entirely succeeding. "Harrison's title is confirmed," he said. "Beaumont's competing claim is rejected and flagged for fraudulent filing. The land office is opening a separate proceeding on the filing itself." He looked at Grace. "And there's a note from Aldridge in Helena. He received your documentation. He says the Marsh complaint from Cincinnati has no standing in Montana, and he's prepared to file for its formal dismissal if needed." Grace read the wire. She read it again. She set it on the table. "Thank you, Sam," she said. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left, giving her the morning. She sat with the wire for a while. Then she went to find Luke. How was at the stable? He usually was early mornings. It was where he went when he was thinking she had learned the same way she went to Hattie's table. She found him with Smoke, actually brushing out the mare's coat, with the same patient, particular attention he brought to everything. And Smoke had her chin over the stall rail, with the expression of a horse who had fully accepted her situation and found it acceptable. Grace handed him the wire. He read it without speaking. He read it a second time. He set it on the rail. He did not whoop or celebrate or make any of the expressions she might have expected from a man who had just been told that 2 years of someone else's greed and pressure and manufactured legal threats had finally been met with the answer they deserved. He stood very still for a moment, his hand flat on Smoke's neck, and breathed. Then he turned to look at Grace. "It's over," she said. "It's over." He said it like a man tasting something he had not been sure he would ever taste. "The land is yours. The creek is yours. The 10 families downstream get to keep their water." She paused. "You held it. We held it." He said it the same way she had said "we" weeks ago at Hattie's table, simply without performance, as a correction of the record. She felt that word in her chest, the same way she had felt it then. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Aldridge and Helena. He wired separately." She folded her hands. "He's building a practice in land rights cases across the territory. He asked if I'd be interested in corresponding work drafting documentation, the kind of thing I've been doing here." She paused. "He said whoever put together the Harrison case had a specific skill for making complex situations legible, and that skill is in short supply." Luke was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd think about it." She met his eyes. "I wanted to tell you first." Something moved through his expression. The complicated, layered movement of a man who understood what was being said in what was not quite being said. The offer held out between the words. "It's your choice," he said. "I know it is. That's why I'm telling you, not asking." He nodded slowly. "Aldridge is a good lawyer. Work like that matters." A beat. "You'd be based here. I'd have to be. The case files are here. The records are here." She let a small beat pass. "I'm here." He looked at her. She looked back. "Then you should tell him yes," Luke said. She had already decided yes. She had decided it before she came to the stable. But she had needed to hear him say it. Not permission, never permission, but acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement of a man who understood the difference between someone choosing to stay and someone staying because they had nowhere else to go, and who wanted the first kind and would not have accepted the second. "I will," she said. A pause. "Luke." "Yes. You said you wanted to ask me something, after the dust settled." She held his gaze. "The dust is settled." He went still in the specific way he went still when something mattered. He set the brush down on the rail. He turned to face her fully, not performing the turning, just doing it the way he did everything, with the direct, unhurried intention of a man who had decided and was finished deciding, and was now simply doing. "I'm not going to ask if you want to stay," he said. "You've answered that." "I have." "I'm not going to ask if you trust me. You've answered that too." "Yes." He took a breath. "I'm going to ask if you want to build something here," he said. "With me. Not because you have nowhere else to go, and not because I need someone to manage the documents, though you do that better than anyone I've ever seen." The corner of his mouth moved almost, just almost. "I'm asking because when you walked out of those trees in the dark with a knife and told 3 men that they were standing on documented property, I understood something I had been working up to understanding for several weeks." She waited. "I understood that I wasn't alone anymore," he said. "Not just that night, in general. That the specific kind of alone I had been for a long time had stopped being true, and that I didn't want to go back to it." He looked at her steadily. "And I think you know what I'm asking." Grace Sullivan stood in the cold stable in Black Hollow Valley, Montana, in the November of 1883, and looked at Luke Harrison, and thought about a woman who had left Ohio with $38.50, and a plan that only lasted as far as the next stage depot, and a knife under her pillow, and a letter she couldn't open for 2.5 years. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself, about whether she was the kind of person who got to have things. A place. People. The specific accumulating wealth of staying. She thought about what she knew now that that woman hadn't known yet. "Yes," she said. "Just that. No conditions, no qualifications, no careful architecture of distance. Yes." He crossed the stable and took her face in both hands the way he had in the dark after the three men left, and this time he wasn't stopping himself from anything. He kissed her the way he did everything, without performance, without haste, with the complete and serious attention of a man who understood that this mattered and intended to make sure she knew he understood that. She put both hands on his chest and kissed him back, and felt the solid, real, specific warmth of a human being who had chosen her, and whom she had chosen, with her eyes open, and her history visible, and her name fully her own. Smoke made a soft philosophical sound from the stall, and went back to her hay. They were married in the spring. Not because they had to be, not because anyone in Black Hollow Valley would have said a word either way, but because they wanted to be, which was the only reason that had ever mattered to either of them, and which they had both arrived at without discussion. Because some things, when they are right, require no argument. Hattie cried, which she denied. Clara did not cry, but she was extremely busy blinking for most of the morning. Coulter was best man. A title he accepted with the solemnity of a 23-year-old who had decided to be serious about things, and intended to be serious about this most of all. Gus and the downstream ranchers came, and two families from the North Range, and the county clerk Hughes, who had witnessed more of this story than he'd planned to, and had decided he was invested in the outcome. Even Otto the blacksmith came with strong opinions about wedding celebrations that he was not shy about sharing. Grace wore a dress that was not her old prairie dress. She had sent that one on to a women's aid society in Helena, along with a substantial portion of the first payment from Aldridge, which was another kind of choosing she intended to keep making. The new dress was the color of winter sky, which in Montana was a specific clean cold blue that she had come to love the way you love colors you associate with the first place that felt like yours. She stood in Hattie's front room. They had moved the furniture back because there was no church big enough and no space more fitting. And she held Luke's hands and said the words, and she felt every word land in her body, the way true things land, with weight and with permanence, and she did not look for the exit. She had stopped looking for the exit. In the months that followed, Grace Sullivan, Grace Harrison. Now, though, she kept Sullivan in the professional correspondence, because it was the name on the documents, and the documents were the record, built something she had not known she was capable of building. The work with Aldridge grew. Other ranchers came, families who had been pressed by other Beaumonts in other valleys and hadn't known they had legal recourse, hadn't known that documentation was armor and clarity was a weapon, and that the law applied with skill and patience was sometimes enough. She wrote letters and drafted complaints and organized evidence into narratives that federal agents and county clerks could follow, and she was very good at it. And the goodness of it was not the validation of being told she was good, but the simpler, more sustaining satisfaction of doing useful work in the world that only she could do exactly this way. She and Luke worked the ranch in the particular partnership of two people who had both spent years doing everything alone and had discovered that most things were neither harder nor easier with two people, but were simply different, accompanied instead of solitary, witnessed instead of private. He knew things about land and weather and animals that she learned from him the way you learn the language of a place you're living in, by immersion, by necessity, by love. She knew things about systems and language and the way powerful men thought that he had never needed to know until he had, and that she taught him with the directness and lack of condescension that she had always wished someone had offered her. They argued. Specifically, precisely about real things, the way people argue when they respect each other enough to disagree out loud. She was stubborn. He was patient in a way that could be its own kind of stubbornness. They found their way through every argument to the other side, which was not agreement exactly, but was always understanding, and understanding turned out to be enough. Hattie stayed in their lives in the way Hattie did everything, without announcement, without ceremony, just present and practical, and periodically bringing coffee at the right moment. Clara taught school for 2 more years, and then moved to Billings, which she wrote long letters from, and Grace wrote long letters back, the specific correspondence of 2 women who had been in the same place at the same time and understood what it meant to each other. Coulter was promoted to sheriff inside of 18 months, which surprised no one who had watched him in the previous year and a half. Beaumont left the valley. He did not leave dramatically. He did not leave with visible defeat. He left the way powerful men leave situations that have stopped being profitable efficiently, without looking back, because men like Beaumont were not sentimental about losses. They simply moved to the next calculation. But he left. And the water kept running through the creek on Luke's East Range, and the 10 families downstream kept their farms, and the land did what good land does when people stop fighting over it and start living on it instead. Marsh did not come back. Aldridge filed the formal dismissal of the Cincinnati complaint and sent Grace the signed order, which she put in the documentation case, alongside the wage records and the letter from Marsh and the accounting she had written to herself in Colorado. The case was full now. Not of grievance of evidence. The complete record of a woman who had survived, documented, and prevailed. She kept it on the shelf in the front room of the ranch house between Luke's deed tin and a small framed photograph of both of them that Clara had arranged to have taken by a traveling photographer in the spring. In the photograph, Grace is not smiling exactly. She is holding Luke's hand and looking at the camera with the steady, direct look of a woman who has decided something and is finished deciding and is now simply living it. Luke is looking at her, not the camera. His expression is the look she had come to know as the fullest version of him, the one that held everything without performing any of it. They looked like what they were. Two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes. Two people who had stopped running in the same direction and decided to stay. Sometimes on cold nights in Black Hollow Valley, the story was still told. Not in the boarding house where Grace had once sat with her boot halfway to the stirrup and her plan set and her heart closed. Not only there. In kitchens and front rooms and across fences between neighbors and on the road between town and the North Range, told the way things are told when they have become part of the fabric of a place. People told it the way they told it, that there had been a woman who arrived afraid, and a cowboy who had been alone too long, and a night when she almost rode away into a storm, and he said 4 words, just 4, and she stopped. They said he asked her to stay. They had it slightly wrong. He had not asked her to stay. He had asked her not to run. The staying had been hers. Every part of it had been hers. The choice to stand still. The choice to put down roots in the particular place that the roots wanted to go. The choice to fight for something rather than away from something. The choice to love someone, not because she had no other options, but because she had looked at all her options and chosen him on purpose, with full knowledge as a free woman making a free choice. That was the story. Not the story of a man who saved a woman. The story of a woman who saved herself in a valley she had never planned to stop in, beside a man who understood that the best thing he could do was stand beside her and mean it. And on the night she had almost run, when the Montana cold was thorough and the road to Ridgecrest stretched out dark and uncertain ahead of her, and she had one foot in the stirrup and her whole life pointed away, she had heard 4 words. She had stopped. She had chosen. And every good thing that came after was built on that one moment of choosing to stay.